My name is Riley. I am 30 years old, and I am an independent forensic accountant. I spent 24 agonizing days in a hospital trauma unit fighting for my life, hooked up to medical monitors. During that terrifying ordeal, not a single member of my family bothered to visit or even call. 2 weeks after I was discharged, my mother finally sent me a text message. She did not ask if I was healing or if I was even breathing. She simply demanded that I transfer $16,000 for my sister's custom wedding dress by 5 o'clock that evening. I opened my banking app, sent her exactly $16, and replied with 2 words: "Good luck." I had no idea my small act of defiance would trigger a chain reaction, resulting in federal indictments. Before I take you through the darkest and most satisfying month of my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been forced to stand alone when the people who were supposed to protect you threw you to the wolves. The nightmare began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in downtown Seattle. I was crossing 4th Avenue, holding a cup of coffee, and thinking about a massive corporate audit I was scheduled to finish. I had the right of way. I was in the crosswalk. But the driver of a heavy utility van was too busy looking at a text message to notice the red light. The impact was deafening. I do not remember the actual collision, only the terrifying sensation of flying through the cold air and the brutal crushing weight of hitting the wet pavement. I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit of Seattle General Hospital. My body was broken. I had a fractured pelvis, 3 shattered ribs, a collapsed lung, and a severe concussion. My right leg was immobilized in a heavy brace pinned together with surgical steel. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of broken glass. The nurses told me I had survived emergency surgery and that I was incredibly lucky to be alive. But as the fog of anesthesia slowly lifted, a different kind of pain began to settle in my chest. A hospital is a place of constant chaotic noise. There is the endless rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors, the quiet murmurs of doctors changing shifts, and the agonizing cries of other patients. Yet amidst all that clamor, the silence from my family was the loudest sound in the room. My personal belongings had been recovered from the accident scene and placed in a plastic bag on my bedside table. When I finally found the strength to reach for my phone and plug it into a charger provided by a kind nurse, I fully expected to see dozens of frantic messages. I expected missed calls from my mother Brenda, voicemails from my father Thomas, and panicked texts from my younger sister Brittany. Instead, my lock screen was completely empty. Nothing. Not a single notification. I lay there staring at the blank screen, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room highlighting my complete isolation. I remained in that hospital bed for 24 days. During that time, I endured painful physical therapy sessions, battled secondary infections, and spent countless hours staring at the ceiling tiles. I watched the woman in the bed next to me receive daily visits from her husband, who brought her fresh flowers and read to her. I watched elderly patients get surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Meanwhile, I sat alone. Every morning I would check my phone. Every evening I would check it again. The silence stretched on, transforming from a sharp sting into a deep, dull ache. It became blatantly clear that my parents and sister were carrying on with their lives, completely unbothered by the fact that I had nearly died. They knew I was in the hospital. The police had contacted my emergency contacts on the day of the accident. Brenda and Thomas had been informed of my critical condition. They simply chose not to show up. Lying in that sterile bed with nothing but time to think, I realized this abandonment was not an anomaly. It was the absolute peak of a dynamic that had defined my entire existence. I was always the outsider in my own home. Growing up, I was the quiet, analytical child who preferred spreadsheets and logic puzzles to social climbing. My parents found my introverted nature embarrassing. Brittany, however, was the golden child. She was loud, demanding, and fiercely focused on appearances. To Brenda and Thomas, Brittany was a status symbol, a beautiful extension of their own egos. When I graduated at the top of my class with my accounting degree, my parents skipped the ceremony entirely because Brittany had scheduled a dress fitting for her first ultimately failed engagement. I was expected to be entirely self-sufficient, a background character whose only value was providing occasional financial advice or fixing a tax issue. The family dynamic only grew more toxic when Jamal entered the picture 2 years ago. Jamal was an African-American investment broker who dazzled my parents with his smooth-talking charm and designer suits. He promised them exclusive returns and flaunted a lifestyle of luxury cars and high-end country clubs. From the moment Brittany introduced him, Jamal was treated like absolute royalty by my parents. They hung on his every word, treating his superficial financial jargon like gospel. As a forensic accountant, I had always found Jamal incredibly suspicious. True wealth whispers, but Jamal was always screaming about his success. Yet whenever I tried to voice my concerns, my father Thomas would silence me, accusing me of being jealous of my sister's spectacular catch. I was just the boring number cruncher while Jamal was the visionary who was going to elevate our family's social standing. So I learned to keep my mouth shut and maintain a safe distance from their charade. Now, trapped in a hospital bed with metal pins holding my bones together, the pieces of my past fell into place. I had spent 30 years trying to earn a place in a family that only viewed me as a utility. They did not love me. They did not even care if I survived. The realization was devastating, but as the 24th day approached, the grief began to evaporate. The tears I shed in the first week dried up completely. The crushing vulnerability of being abandoned was slowly replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. By the time the doctor cleared me for discharge, I was no longer the desperate daughter hoping for a phone call. I was a survivor, and I was about to look at my family with the clinical, merciless precision of a forensic audit. The discharge process was a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. A billing coordinator with tired eyes handed me a heavy clipboard loaded with itemized invoices. My insurance covered a significant portion of the trauma care, but the out-of-pocket maximums and out-of-network surgical fees were astronomical. I balanced my weight carefully on my good leg, leaning heavily against the sterile laminate counter, and pulled my debit card from my wallet. My eyes scanned the lines of charges with the automatic scrutiny of a forensic accountant. Every pill, every scan, every hour in the intensive care unit had a specific billing code. I did not blink as I authorized a transaction that wiped out a massive chunk of my hard-earned savings. There was no mother standing beside me to offer comfort, no father offering to handle the tedious paperwork, and no sister pulling a car around to the front curb. I signed the electronic pad with a steady hand, securing my own freedom at a steep financial cost. Navigating the hospital exit was my first true test of physical endurance. Transitioning from the institutional wheelchair to my custom forearm crutches required a terrifying amount of concentration. The heavy surgical brace locked my right leg in a rigid, unforgiving angle. Every micro-movement sent a sharp, electrifying jolt of agony through my fractured pelvis, while my shattered ribs screamed in protest against the simple act of drawing a deep breath. A hospital orderly escorted me to the automatic doors, his hands hovering nervously as I awkwardly maneuvered myself into the back of a specialized medical transport van. I thanked him, tipped the driver, and stared out the window as the gray Seattle skyline rolled past. The rain battered the glass, mirroring the cold reality of my new existence. I watched the busy streets, the people rushing to warm homes, and waiting families, feeling like an alien visitor, completely detached from the normal human experience. The journey from the curb of my apartment building to my front door was a grueling marathon. The simple architecture of my building, the slight incline of the entryway ramp, the heavy brass handle of the lobby door, all transformed into monumental obstacles. By the time I reached my floor and fumbled with my keys, sweat coated my forehead and my lungs burned with exhaustion. I pushed the door open and hobbled inside. My apartment was perfectly dark and suffocatingly still. It looked exactly as it had the morning the utility van shattered my life. A half-empty coffee mug sat abandoned on the kitchen island, a faint ring of mold forming at the bottom. The mail I had tossed on the console table was still scattered there. My houseplants, usually vibrant and carefully tended, were drooping and brown from a month of absolute neglect. The air smelled stale, heavy with trapped dust and the undeniable scent of absence. I managed to reach the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, the heavy leg brace thudding awkwardly against the edge of the coffee table. The physical pain radiating through my bones was intense, yet it paled in comparison to the sheer weight of the emotional betrayal pressing down on my chest. Sitting in that absolute silence, looking at the dead plants and the stagnant dust, the final threads of denial snapped. If my family cared even a fraction of an amount, someone would have come to my apartment. Someone would have collected my mail, watered my plants, or left a note on the counter. They had not simply forgotten me in the chaos of life. They had actively, deliberately discarded me. I was a blood relative in name, only a ghost to the people who shared my DNA. For years I had carried a persistent toxic guilt. I had internalized my mother's harsh criticisms and my father's icy dismissiveness, secretly wondering if my introversion and focus on my career made me a genuinely bad daughter. I had continuously tried to contort myself into a shape they might find acceptable, managing their minor financial issues, hoping that one day I would earn my seat at their table. I had treated their affection as a debt I constantly needed to pay down. That guilt died right there on my sofa. It withered and crumbled just like the neglected ferns in the corner of my room. I began to view my familial relationships the same way I viewed a corrupted corporate ledger. The return on investment for my love and loyalty was entirely negative. The lingering vulnerability I had felt in the intensive care unit hardened into an icy, impenetrable resolve. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my contact list, navigated to the Favorites tab, and systematically removed Brenda Thomas and Brittany. I did not block them yet. I simply stripped them of their priority status. I stopped waiting for a notification that was never going to come. I stopped hoping for an apology they were fundamentally incapable of giving. The desperate, lonely girl who had spent 24 days checking her screen for a sign of love was completely gone. In her place sat a woman who understood the raw, unvarnished truth of a balanced equation. My family was a bankrupt account, a massive liability that I was finally writing off. I leaned my head back against the cushions, closed my eyes, and began mentally mapping out my recovery. I would schedule my own physical therapy. I would arrange my own grocery deliveries. I would rebuild my physical strength with the same relentless precision I applied to my corporate audits. I was entirely alone, and for the very first time in my life, that realization did not frighten me. It armed me. I had survived the absolute worst they could do by doing nothing at all, and I was fully prepared for whatever they dared to throw at me next. Exactly 14 days had passed since I dragged my broken body across the threshold of my apartment. I had engineered a ruthless, solitary routine. My mornings began with the excruciating regimen of physical therapy, stretching my damaged muscles with resistance bands until tears pricked my eyes. My afternoons were spent propped up at my kitchen island, surrounded by a fortress of medical bills, insurance claim denials, and bank statements. The silence of my home had transformed from a haunting void into a protective shield. I was healing slowly, knitting myself back together without the toxic interference of the people who shared my last name. The brutal physical reality of my recovery required all my energy, leaving absolutely no room for grief or self-pity. It was precisely 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon when the silence was shattered. The sharp synthetic chime of a text message notification echoed off the hardwood floors. It was a jarring sound. Aside from automated appointment reminders from my orthopedic surgeon and a few check-ins from professional colleagues, my personal phone had been a barren wasteland for nearly 40 days. I set down my pen, the quiet scratching of ink against paper ceasing abruptly. My pulse ticked up a fraction of a beat. I reached across the granite countertop and picked up the device. The name illuminated on the glass screen was a single word: Brenda. For a microsecond, a deeply ingrained, almost involuntary biological reflex flared to life. A microscopic, foolish fraction of my brain wondered if reality had finally crashed down upon my mother. I wondered if the sheer gravity of my near-death experience had finally penetrated her thick armor of narcissism. Perhaps she was writing to ask if I was awake, if I could breathe on my own, or if I had permanently lost the ability to walk. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. There was no greeting. There was no tentative inquiry about my health. There was not a single syllable acknowledging the fact that I had been pulverized by a commercial vehicle and left to rot in a trauma ward. It was a sterile, transactional demand. The family needs $16,000 for Brittany's custom wedding dress. Transfer it by 5 p.m. Jamal's capital is tied up in a massive portfolio. Don't be selfish today. I read the words once. Then I read them a second time, letting the syllables echo in the quiet space of my kitchen. The visceral reaction hit me like a secondary collision. A cold, sharp wave of adrenaline flooded my veins, causing the titanium pins in my leg to throb in rhythm with my heartbeat. The sheer, unfiltered audacity of the demand was so astronomically high that it temporarily short-circuited my ability to process human emotion. I stared at the glowing pixels dissecting the message with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent expense report. $16,000. While I had been lying in a sterile hospital bed fighting off secondary infections and rationing my pain medication because my deductibles were draining my life savings, my mother and sister had been sipping complimentary champagne in a high-end bridal boutique. While I was begging a nurse for ice chips and trying to remember how to breathe without searing agony, they were holding up swatches of imported French lace and debating the merits of a cathedral-length train. And now, facing a bill they could not cover, they simply reached out to the one person they had completely discarded. The sheer entitlement of the deadline transfer it by 5 p.m. was staggering. Brenda did not ask if I had the funds. She did not ask if my medical debts had bankrupted me. She simply issued a directive fully expecting me to comply out of some twisted, lingering sense of familial duty. And then there was the excuse. Jamal's capital is tied up in a massive portfolio. My professional instincts instantly flared sharp and demanding. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days hunting down hidden assets, exposing corporate embezzlement, and unraveling complex financial lies. Wealthy investment brokers do not suddenly find themselves lacking liquid capital for a wedding expense. A legitimate broker with a massive portfolio has lines of credit, liquid reserves, and access to capital that does not involve begging an estranged, critically injured sister-in-law for dress money by the close of business. The financial justification was fundamentally absurd. It was the kind of amateur, hollow excuse used by people who desperately wanted to sound affluent but had absolutely no understanding of how actual wealth functioned. I set the phone down on the counter. The screen went dark, but the words remained branded into my retinas. Don't be selfish today. That final venomous sentence was the catalyst for the ultimate shift in my psychology. The last remaining microscopic thread of familial loyalty snapped with a definitive silent break. Any lingering illusions I harbored about my place in their lives vanished completely. This text message was not merely an insult. It was a profound revelation. I finally understood my exact value. My parents and my sister did not view me as a human being. They did not see a daughter who had almost died, or a sister who was facing months of grueling physical rehabilitation. They saw a walking, breathing financial safety net. I was an emergency contingency plan, an ATM, they could kick whenever Jamal's grand illusions of wealth failed to cover their exorbitant vanity projects. To them, my survival was entirely irrelevant unless it pertained to my ability to authorize a wire transfer. The crushing weight of their emotional neglect evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. I was entirely free. They had handed me the exact evidence I needed to strip away the heavy, suffocating burden of daughterly obligation. They wanted to reduce our entire relationship to a cold, hard financial transaction. They wanted to treat me like a bank. I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen. If it was a transaction they wanted, I was more than ready to balance the ledger. I unlocked my phone and opened my secure banking application. The biometric scanner mapped my face, granting me access to the accounts I had meticulously built over years of grueling corporate audits. I navigated to the transfer portal and pulled up Brenda's saved routing information. My thumb hovered over the numerical keypad. They wanted $16,000 by 5 o'clock. The sheer absurdity of the number demanded a precise, calculated response. I tapped the screen with deliberate focus. 1, 6, decimal point, 0, 0. Exactly $16. I moved down to the mandatory memo line. I did not draft a lengthy explanation or an emotional plea for basic human decency. I typed 2 simple words. Good luck. I authorized the transfer, watched the confirmation graphic appear on the screen, and locked my device. I set the phone face down on the cool granite counter of my kitchen island and waited. It took exactly 4 minutes for the financial shockwave to hit. The profound silence of my apartment was abruptly shattered by the violent, continuous vibration of my cell phone against the stone surface. It sounded like an angry hornet, a relentless buzzing that signaled the exact moment my mother checked her bank balance. I did not pick the device up immediately. I calmly adjusted the rigid straps on my heavy leg brace, feeling the cold surgical steel bite into my skin, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I simply watched the screen light up with incoming calls, illuminating the dark kitchen with flashes of frantic energy. My father called twice. When I let both calls ring through to voicemail, a notification popped up indicating he had left an audio message. I tapped play, letting his absolute fury echo through my quiet apartment. His voice was thick with outrage, lacking any trace of paternal warmth or concern for my physical condition. He did not ask why I sent $16. He did not ask if I had made a clerical error. He immediately launched into a vicious, unhinged tirade. He called me a cold-blooded monster. He shouted that I had always been a selfish, calculating glitch in their otherwise perfect family dynamic. He demanded I correct the transfer immediately or face severe consequences. I listened to his entire rant with the clinical detachment of an investigator reviewing an audio exhibit in a federal court case. His anger was a massive confirmation. I had struck the exact nerve I was aiming for. Before Thomas's voicemail even concluded, a barrage of notifications began flooding our so-called family group chat. Brittany was firing off audio voice notes in rapid succession, bypassing text entirely so I could hear the full extent of her meltdown. I tapped the first audio file. Her voice was shrill, bordering on hysterical. She was screaming so loudly that the audio peaked and severely distorted my phone's tiny speaker. She wailed about how I was intentionally trying to ruin her perfect day out of pure malicious jealousy. She sobbed that Jamal's wealthy African-American family was expecting a grand, flawless event, and my refusal to fund her custom gown was going to humiliate her in front of high society elites. She demanded to know how she was supposed to walk down the aisle and represent the family name without the bespoke designer dress she had already committed to purchasing. I played the next voice note, then the next. Not once did she express a single ounce of concern for my physical condition. Not once did she acknowledge that I was recovering from a near-fatal accident with shattered ribs and a fractured pelvis. Her entire world was collapsing because a wedding vendor was demanding payment, and her designated human cash machine had just declined the transaction. She screamed that I was actively trying to sabotage her union with Jamal, completely blinded by her own manufactured victimhood. Her shrieks were not the sounds of a woman heartbroken by a sibling rivalry. They were the sounds of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because she had been denied a luxury toy. Then came the final message from Brenda. My mother did not bother with frantic audio messages or emotional sobbing. She preferred the cold, hard permanence of written text. Her message arrived in all capital letters, a digital scream cutting through the chaotic aftermath of Brittany's wailing. She stated that if I did not wire the remaining $15,984 by the close of business today, I would be permanently dead to them. She ordered me to never contact the family again if I failed to comply with her ultimatum. I stared at that final absolute threat. Permanently dead to them. A month ago, those specific words would have sent me into a desperate, hyperventilating panic. I would have scrambled to liquidate my investment accounts, drained my emergency savings, and begged for their forgiveness on my hands and knees. I would have done absolutely anything to avoid being cast out of the only family structure I had ever known. But sitting there in my kitchen, feeling the dull, persistent ache of my fractured bones and the rigid confinement of my leg brace, I felt absolutely nothing resembling fear. Instead, a strange bubbling sensation rose in my chest. It was amusement. Pure, unadulterated amusement. They genuinely thought they were punishing me. They believed that cutting me off was the ultimate devastating penalty, completely oblivious to the fact that they were simply formalizing a reality I had already accepted. They were threatening me with the exact outcome I had just engineered. I picked up my phone and opened the group chat settings. I did not type a witty comeback. I did not try to justify my actions or remind them of my traumatizing hospital stay. I simply tapped the mute notifications button. The device instantly went dark and silent. The aggressive vibrations ceased. The digital assault ended as abruptly as it had begun. The profound quiet of my apartment rushed back in, but it no longer felt oppressive or lonely. It felt incredibly victorious. I had drawn a line in the sand, and their explosive reaction only proved how heavily they had relied on my blind compliance. They had mistaken my lifelong desire for acceptance as weakness, assuming they could extract whatever capital they wanted whenever they wanted it. But they had miscalculated terribly. By demanding that outrageous sum of money, they had shown their entire hand. They were desperate, and desperation, especially financial desperation, always leaves a highly visible paper trail. Jamal was supposedly wealthy. My parents were supposedly comfortable, yet they were collectively melting down over a $16,000 invoice. The math simply did not add up. The equation was fundamentally broken, and my professional instincts were suddenly wide awake. My laptop screen had remained dark for barely 20 minutes when a different, softer notification chime pinged through the quiet apartment. It was not another frantic text message or a hysterical voice note injected into the muted family chat. It was an email. The sender name displayed as Jamal Washington, followed by a string of impressive-sounding alphabetical credentials that I knew for a fact he had never officially earned. The subject line read, "Urgent regarding family obligations." He was bypassing the chaotic group text, likely recognizing that my mother and sister's shrieking tactics had failed to extract the necessary capital. Jamal fancied himself the smooth, rational patriarch of our dysfunctional dynamic, the wealthy savior who could negotiate any deal. I tapped the screen, opening the message. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, a dense wall of text overflowing with patronizing condescension and manufactured authority. He began by expressing fake disappointment in my behavior, stating that he understood I was recovering from a minor traffic incident, severely downplaying the fact that I had been shattered by a commercial utility van. But he swiftly transitioned into a lecture about legacy and representation. He claimed that the upcoming wedding was not just a celebration, but a crucial networking event for his high-net-worth associates. He demanded that I fulfill my familial duty to uphold their image. Then came the financial justification, the exact paragraph that sealed his fate. He wrote that he would normally cover such a trivial expense himself, but his liquid capital was temporarily restricted. He explicitly claimed his liquidity was tied up in offshore yields and complex international tax deferments, making a domestic wire transfer of that size impossible before the vendor's deadline. He finished the email by instructing me to be a team player, transfer the funds, and consider it an investment in my sister's future happiness. I sat perfectly still, reading the paragraph a second time. A sharp, cynical smile touched the corners of my mouth. Jamal was accustomed to dealing with Brenda and Thomas, people who were completely financially illiterate and easily dazzled by aggressive confidence and meaningless buzzwords. He assumed I was just a naive bookkeeper, a glorified calculator who filed standard tax returns. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. As a forensic accountant, I did not just balance ledgers. I dissected financial crimes. I unraveled complex money laundering operations, exposed hidden assets in high-conflict divorces, and testified as an expert witness in federal fraud cases. I knew the architecture of genuine wealth, and Jamal's email was structurally unsound. The financial jargon he used was absolute, unfiltered nonsense. Yields are the earnings generated on an investment, not a restrictive vehicle that traps principal capital. You cannot have liquidity tied up in a yield. It is a fundamental contradiction in terms. Furthermore, even if his capital was aggressively locked in offshore accounts or private equity funds, a legitimate, high-performing investment broker would never find himself unable to produce $16,000 in cash. A real broker with a massive portfolio would simply contact his private banker and execute a short-term portfolio line of credit or draw against his domestic assets. The interest on such a small margin loan would be equivalent to the cost of a decent dinner. A true millionaire does not beg an estranged, critically injured sister-in-law for dress money by the close of business. A true millionaire does not risk the profound humiliation of a cash shortage over a basic wedding vendor invoice. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, snapping the final pieces of the puzzle into perfect alignment. Jamal was not a wealthy investment prodigy. He was broke. The luxurious lifestyle, the designer suits, the country club memberships, and the entire wedding spectacle were nothing but a carefully constructed facade. He was a con artist running a high-stakes shell game, and he had just run out of other people's money. My parents were so desperate to secure their place in his fictional high society that they had blinded themselves to the glaring red flags. But if Jamal was bankrupt, a dark, terrifying question immediately presented itself. How were they currently funding a luxury country estate wedding that was easily tracking to cost well over $200,000? My parents were comfortably middle class, entirely reliant on my father's salary and a modest retirement account. They did not have the liquid assets to cover the deposits on imported orchids and champagne towers. There was a massive gaping hole in the ledger. Capital was flowing into this wedding from an unknown source, and Jamal's desperate email proved that the source was suddenly drying up. I threw off the light blanket covering my legs and gripped the handles of my forearm crutches. The sharp, familiar pain radiated through my fractured pelvis, a fiery warning that my bones were still knitting together, but I ignored it. The vulnerability of the hospital ward was a distant memory. I was no longer the discarded daughter mourning a family that never truly existed. I was a predator who had just caught the scent of blood on the wind. I hoisted myself upright and navigated the short hallway toward the spare bedroom I had converted into a dedicated home office. I pushed the door open, flicked on the overhead light, and hobbled over to my desk. It was an expansive L-shaped workstation, dominating the room, equipped with a heavy-duty processing tower and 3 large high-definition monitors arrayed in a semicircle. This was my sanctuary, the place where chaos was reduced to clean, undeniable data. I carefully lowered myself into my ergonomic chair, adjusting my rigid leg brace under the desk. I woke the computer from sleep mode, the 3 screens flaring to life, casting a cool blue glow across the darkened room. I logged into my secure VPN, bypassing the standard firewalls, and opened my specialized investigative databases. I pulled up public property records, civil court dockets, and corporate LLC registries. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Jamal Washington wanted to play a high-stakes financial game with my family. He wanted to use corporate buzzwords to intimidate me into handing over my savings. He had made a fatal miscalculation. I pulled my keyboard close, stared at the blank search fields across my monitors, and prepared to do the one thing I was truly exceptional at. I was going to follow the money. The cursor blinked against the stark white background of the search query field, a digital heartbeat pulsing in the quiet of my home office. I began with the absolute basics, typing Jamal Washington alongside the name of his supposedly prestigious investment firm, Apex Capital Yields. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, relentless precision. The physical pain radiating from my healing pelvis faded entirely into the background, eclipsed by the intoxicating rush of the hunt. I was in my element, navigating the labyrinth of public records and corporate registries with the cold, predatory focus of a seasoned forensic accountant. I targeted the state corporate registry in Delaware, first a common sanctuary for individuals looking to obscure their financial footprints. The search returned a single glaring result. Apex Capital Yields was indeed a registered limited liability company, but the details were laughable. The entity had been formed a mere 18 months ago. The principal business address listed on the incorporation documents was not a sleek, high-rise corporate suite in a financial district. I ran the address through a satellite mapping application. The result was a virtual post office box located inside a dilapidated strip mall, packing and shipping store, sandwiched directly between a discount dry cleaner and a vacant storefront. There were no executive officers listed. There was no board of directors. The registered agent was a cut-rate online legal service that charged $50 to mask true corporate ownership. I immediately cross-referenced the corporate entity and Jamal's personal name with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority database and the Securities and Exchange Commission registry. A legitimate high-net-worth investment broker actively managing massive portfolios must be federally registered. The search algorithms churned for a fraction of a second before returning 0 results. Jamal Washington was not legally licensed to trade securities, offer financial advice, or manage capital in any official capacity within the United States. His entire firm was a hollow, fabricated shell, a worthless paper construct designed solely to look impressive on a heavy cardstock business card. With the corporate illusion shattered, I pivoted my investigation toward his personal financial history. I logged into the public access to court electronic record system, pulling federal bankruptcy filings and civil court dockets across multiple states. If a man is actively moving significant capital and living a life of luxury, he inevitably leaves a substantial financial footprint. Jamal had indeed left a massive footprint, but it was entirely composed of catastrophic debt. The legal judgments stacked up across my high-resolution monitors like a testament to his utter financial ruin. A luxury auto financing company in Georgia had successfully sued him for a defaulted lease on a high-end sports car, resulting in a forced repossession. 3 major credit card issuers had secured aggressive civil judgments against him for completely maxed-out accounts, with the unpaid balances totaling well over $120,000. A previous landlord in a prestigious downtown high-rise had evicted him for 8 consecutive months of unpaid rent, leaving a trail of broken lease agreements and collection agency notices. The deeper I mined into the data, the uglier and more pathetic the picture became. The bespoke, tailored suits, the aura of untouchable generational wealth, and the arrogant corporate posturing were financed entirely by predatory lending, unpaid invoices, and a web of maxed-out credit lines. He was not a misunderstood financial genius suffering from a temporary liquidity crisis. He was a textbook confidence man, a grifter drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. He had specifically targeted Brittany, instantly recognizing her desperate, shallow ambition and her absolute profound lack of basic financial literacy. He had identified my parents as the perfect marks a middle-class couple so entirely obsessed with climbing the social ladder that they would eagerly ignore every glaring red flag if it meant securing a wealthy, prestigious son-in-law. He was systematically using them to fund his extravagant lifestyle, playing the part of the eccentric millionaire whose vast assets were perpetually tied up in imaginary offshore yields. He was using my family as a human shield against his aggressive creditors. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the cool, artificial light from the monitors casting long, harsh shadows across the room. The initial satisfying rush of exposing his massive fraud quickly morphed into a cold, hard knot of analytical confusion. The numbers staring back at me created a glaring, impossible paradox. Jamal was legally and practically bankrupt. My parents, while comfortable, were distinctly ordinary middle-class earners. For years, I had personally managed their annual tax returns. I knew their exact financial architecture. I knew my father had a decent but finite pension, And I knew my mother managed their household expenses with coupon clipping precision. Their combined liquid savings rarely exceeded $30,000. Yet they were currently orchestrating a luxury country estate wedding that was conservatively tracking to cost upward of $250,000. The massive floral installations, the exclusive venue deposit, the catered artisanal menus, and the custom designer dress they had just demanded I pay for all required monumental infusions of liquid cash. High-end vendors in the competitive wedding industry do not operate on credit or promises of future offshore yields. They demand hard currency upfront. The mathematical equation was fundamentally broken. If Jamal had a net worth of zero, and my parents had a net worth that could not possibly cover a fraction of the event, the capital had to be materializing from a secondary, completely hidden origin. Wealth does not spontaneously generate out of thin air. Money always obeys the laws of physics. It flows from a distinct point of origin to a distinct destination. I had successfully identified the destination. The wedding was a massive financial black hole rapidly consuming hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now I needed to isolate the origin. I stared intensely at the glowing screens, my analytical mind racing through every possible terrifying scenario. Had my parents taken out a predatory second mortgage on their modest home, risking foreclosure for a single day of manufactured prestige? Had they completely liquidated their retirement accounts, sacrificing their entire future to impress a man who was actively conning them? Or had they done something infinitely more reckless and potentially illegal to secure the cash? The silence of my apartment felt heavy with anticipation. The physical pain in my shattered leg was completely forgotten, replaced by a singular burning need for the truth. I reached out, pulled my keyboard closer, and opened a new secure search portal, absolutely determined to find the missing piece of the puzzle. A fundamental principle of forensic accounting dictates that when a target's primary financial perimeter yields a vacuum, you immediately expand the radius of your inquiry. I had exhausted my parents' visible assets. I had dismantled Jamal's fraudulent corporate kingdom. Yet the phantom capital funding this extravagant wedding remained entirely unaccounted for. I sat back in the glow of my monitors, my mind shifting gears. If they had not sourced the money from their own accounts, and they had not secured it through legitimate commercial lenders due to a lack of collateral, they had to have utilized a proxy. They needed a host organism. They needed someone with an immaculate credit history, a zero debt-to-income ratio, and substantial unencumbered assets. They needed someone exactly like me. A cold, creeping sensation spidered up the back of my neck. It was a visceral, instinctual warning, a sudden shift from professional curiosity to deeply personal dread. Out of pure, ingrained habit, I opened a new secure browser tab and navigated directly to my encrypted Tri-Bureau credit monitoring portal. I paid for the highest tier of commercial identity protection, a necessity in my line of work, though. I typically only reviewed the consolidated reports during quarterly tax assessments. I entered my credentials, authenticated the login with a biometric scan from my phone, and initiated a comprehensive real-time pull of my Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion files. The digital progress bar crawled across the center screen. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself I was being paranoid. My mother was shallow, materialistic, and breathtakingly self-centered, but financial fraud was a severe federal crime. Surely there was a boundary even she would not cross. The portal refreshed. The data populated. I stopped breathing. The air in my home office suddenly felt too thin, entirely insufficient to sustain my lungs. My pristine, meticulously maintained credit score, a number I had guarded with relentless discipline for my entire adult life, had completely cratered. It was a digital bloodbath. Blinking red warning icons dominated the dashboard, flagging severe negative impacts, excessive credit utilization, and multiple hard inquiries from unrecognized financial institutions. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes darting frantically across the itemized list of active trade lines. My vision blurred momentarily. I blinked hard, forcing the raw data into focus. There, sitting at the very top of the liability column, was a massive, entirely unfamiliar mortgage product. It was a home equity line of credit leveraged directly against the paid-off equity of my apartment. The principal balance drawn against my property was a staggering $90,000. My hands began to tremble. I scrolled down, the horror compounding with every line of text. Beneath the fraudulent property lien sat a cluster of brand-new revolving credit accounts. There was an elite platinum travel card, a premium rewards account, and a high-limit luxury retail card. Every single one of them was completely maxed out. I mentally tallied the outstanding balances, my brain performing the arithmetic with sickening speed. The $30,000 in unsecured credit card debt combined with the $90,000 property loan brought the total aggregate liability to exactly $120,000. $120,000 of stolen capital. A physical wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. The sheer magnitude of the theft was paralyzing. I clicked into the detailed view of the massive property loan, my professional detachment completely shattered, replaced by a raw primal panic. I needed to see the origination documents. I needed to trace the digital footprints of the thieves. I isolated the account creation dates, sorting the data by timestamp to build a precise chronological sequence of the fraud. The first application, a hard pull for the premium travel card, was initiated on a Tuesday. The property loan underwriting process began 3 days later. The remaining credit lines were opened in rapid succession over the following 2 weeks. I stared at the dates, a chilling absolute silence descending upon the room. The numbers were not just random data points. They mapped a very specific, undeniable timeline. I pulled up my personal calendar on the adjacent monitor. I cross-referenced the origination dates of the fraudulent loans with the darkest chapter of my own life. The alignment was flawless, a perfectly synchronized overlap that turned the blood in my veins to ice. The very first credit application was submitted exactly 48 hours after the utility van crushed my pelvis. The massive property loan was approved, and the funds were disbursed while I was chemically paralyzed, relying on a mechanical ventilator to push oxygen into my lungs. The entire $120,000 had been systematically extracted during the exact 24-day window I spent unconscious in the intensive care unit. The missing piece of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating, undeniable force. Jamal had not magically produced the capital. My parents had not secretly saved a fortune. They had stolen it from me. While I was fighting a desperate, agonizing battle for my own survival, my mother had utilized her status as my emergency contact and next of kin. She had possessed unlimited access to my apartment, supposedly to collect my mail and feed my plants. Instead of tending to my home, she had bypassed my security, located my personal fireproof safe, and extracted my social security card, my birth certificate, and my property deeds. She had handed my entire financial identity over to Jamal, a man who possessed the exact type of illicit back-channel connections necessary to push through fraudulent loan applications without a physical signature or an in-person notary. They had harvested my life savings to fund a wedding cake and a champagne tower. They had mortgaged the roof over my head to pay for imported floral arrangements and a custom bridal gown. They had quite literally bet on my death. The realization was absolute and horrifying. If I had succumbed to my injuries, the massive debts they had incurred in my name would have simply been absorbed by my estate during probate. They would have walked away with a luxury wedding completely free and clear, leaving my corpse to foot the bill. My miraculous survival was not a cause for celebration. It was a massive, terrifying inconvenience to their criminal enterprise. My mother's demand for an additional $16,000 was not just entitlement, it was an act of extreme desperation. The fraudulent credit lines were exhausted. The property loan was fully drawn. They had hit the absolute ceiling of what they could extract from my identity without raising alarms. I was no longer looking at a toxic, narcissistic family dynamic. I was looking at a coordinated felony-level criminal conspiracy. The icy shock of the betrayal began to thaw rapidly, replaced by a searing white-hot rage. It was a different kind of anger than the emotional pain I had felt earlier. This was a precise, calculated wrath. It was the fury of a woman who had been left for dead and then financially butchered by the very people who were supposed to protect her. I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat in the blue light of my monitors, feeling the titanium hardware in my leg, and made a silent ironclad vow. I was going to tear their entire world to the ground. I reached for my mouse, opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop, and began systematically downloading every single piece of evidence. The audit had officially begun. The audit had officially begun. I needed the raw metadata. Modern financial institutions do not simply hand over massive sums of cash in a digital vacuum. They record every single breath an applicant takes online. I utilized a specialized compliance portal, a backdoor gateway accessible only to certified fraud examiners and regulatory auditors. Masking my intensely personal stake behind my official corporate credentials, I drafted a series of aggressive preservation orders. I cited specific anti-money laundering statutes to compel the lender's fraud departments to immediately release the application server logs, threatening severe regulatory friction if they hesitated. I did not ask nicely. I wielded my professional title like a blunt instrument, and within hours, encrypted data packets began flooding into my secure inbox. I fed the raw alphanumeric strings into a proprietary geospatial tracking algorithm. Every digital action leaves a unique, undeniable fingerprint, and I was hunting for the exact origin point of the data packets that had authorized the destruction of my financial life. The tracking interface churned, filtering through carrier hubs and regional nodes before dropping a stark glowing red pin directly onto a high-resolution satellite map. The signal did not bounce through a Russian server farm or hide behind a hacker syndicate's proxy network. The longitude and latitude coordinates zeroed in on a quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac in a perfectly manicured suburban neighborhood. I extracted the media access control address and the primary IP signature from the server logs. It was the exact router registered to Brenda and Thomas's home address. I recognized the network signature immediately. It was the very same dual-band router I had personally installed for them 2 Thanksgivings ago. They had sat in their comfortable living room drinking coffee and watching television, while casually submitting forged loan applications over a network I had secured for them. But a localized IP address was only half the equation. High-limit credit disbursements require stringent two-factor authentication. The banking institutions mandate SMS verification to ensure the applicant is physically authorizing the release of funds. I parsed the secondary verification logs, extracting the destination phone numbers that had received the automated security codes. I ran the digits through a restricted telecommunications carrier database, easily bypassing the unlisted registry protections. The primary verification number did not belong to my mother's smartphone or my father's cellular plan. The account was registered directly to Jamal Washington. The mechanics of the operation crystallized with sickening clarity, revealing a perfectly symbiotic criminal enterprise. Jamal was the architect. He possessed the superficial, manipulative industry knowledge required to navigate the automated underwriting algorithms. He knew exactly which income brackets to fabricate and which debt-to-income ratios would bypass a manual underwriter review. However, Jamal was blacklisted by every major financial institution in the country. He could not secure a loan for a cup of coffee. Brenda and Thomas were the key holders. They possessed the physical access to my most closely guarded personal documents. They had leveraged their biological relationship to bypass my apartment's security, treating my life's work as an all-access ATM. They provided the immaculate identity. Jamal provided the fraudulent execution. I followed the capital. The money was not sitting idle, nor was it being transferred in one massive, easily detectable lump sum. I isolated the outgoing wire transfers from the newly established fraudulent accounts. The thieves were utilizing a classic money laundering technique known as structuring. The funds were being meticulously drip-fed out of my compromised accounts in highly specific increments, always remaining just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal currency transaction reports. Exactly $9,800 here, $9,900 there. The capital was washing through the hollow shell of Apex Capital Yields, effectively masking the origin of the stolen funds, before being cleanly redistributed to high-end catering companies, boutique florists, and luxury event planners. My stolen future, the money I had bled for, was currently financing their imported orchids and artisanal appetizers. I stared at my smartphone resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. The local police precinct was 3 keystrokes away. I could have a patrol car sitting in my parents' driveway before lunch. I could trigger a localized fraud alert, freeze the compromised accounts, and stop the hemorrhaging of my assets instantly. My fingers hovered over the glass screen, my heart hammering a furious, violent rhythm against my ribs. But the cold, analytical side of my brain, the side that hunted white-collar criminals for a living, violently overrode the impulse. A simple police report would trigger a standard sluggish municipal investigation. The banks would eventually lock the accounts, but the moment the funds froze, Jamal's meticulously calibrated radar would go off. He would realize the grift was exposed. He would immediately destroy his hard drives, torch his burner phones, and vanish into the wind, leaving Brenda and Thomas to play the roles of confused, technologically illiterate victims who were supposedly duped by a sophisticated cyber scammer. They would cry tears of ignorance, claim their identities had also been compromised, and walk away with a slap on the wrist while my credit remained in ashes. That outcome was entirely unacceptable. I did not want a paused transaction or a canceled floral arrangement. I wanted absolute inescapable annihilation. I wanted mandatory federal minimums. I created a new heavily encrypted master case file on my offline server. I titled it simply with Jamal's and my parents' surnames. I began extracting and categorizing every single piece of digital evidence. I captured localized screenshots, downloaded the raw server logs, archived the IP trace routes, and compiled the structured wire transfer receipts. I mapped the flow of the stolen capital using advanced forensic link analysis, drawing undeniable brightly colored lines connecting my parents' router to Jamal's phone, and finally to the wedding vendors' bank accounts. I was no longer a victim seeking basic restitution. I was meticulously building a bulletproof federal dossier for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I was going to hand the federal prosecutor a wrapped, airtight case of wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. They wanted to use my identity to fund their perfect manufactured day of luxury. I was going to ensure that day ended with federal indictments. I established 4 primary evidence directories on my encrypted local server, isolating the stolen data into airtight forensic compartments. I named them meticulously, ensuring each represented a specific, undeniable pillar of the fraud. The first directory detailing the unauthorized loan origination data and the initial banking IP traces. The second compartment containing the parsed routing pathways connecting my parents' residential internet protocol address to the banking applications. I secured the structured wire transfer logs tracking the stolen capital flowing from my compromised home equity line directly into the accounts of high-end wedding vendors. Finally, the forged digital signatures, specifically the detailed authentication logs that falsely attested to my physical presence and active consent. With the digital framework secured, I turned to the physical evidence. I connected my secure laser printer and generated hard copies of my intensive care unit medical charts. I laid the thick stack of papers across the expansive surface of my mahogany desk. The stark black text detailed the terrifying reality of my physical state. The charts documented my abysmal Glasgow coma scale, scores the heavy intravenous dosages of fentanyl and propofol required to keep me sedated, and the exact agonizing hours I spent intubated and tethered to a mechanical ventilator. Beside these physical medical records, I placed the time-stamped financial logs I had extracted from the credit bureaus. The contrast between the 2 sets of documents was a grotesque, undeniable masterpiece of betrayal. I picked up a fluorescent yellow highlighter and began mapping the intersections. At 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, My medical chart noted a critical drop in my blood pressure, requiring emergency intervention by a team of trauma surgeons. At precisely 2:15 that very same afternoon, an electronic completion certificate was generated on the bank's server bearing my forged digital signature, authorizing the release of a $30,000 credit line. They were literally signing my financial death warrant while medical professionals were frantically fighting to keep my heart beating. I highlighted every single overlapping timestamp. My mother had stood in my apartment utilizing my private documents, while my father likely stood watch, and Jamal navigated the banking portals remotely. With the foundation of the federal dossier solidified, I initiated the most psychologically demanding phase of the operation. I had to play the compliant, submissive, and financially oblivious victim. I could not alert them to the steel trap rapidly closing around them. A premature confrontation would ruin everything. I did not freeze the compromised accounts. I did not lock down my credit profile with the bureaus. I did not block my mother's cell phone number or send Jamal's arrogant emails to my spam folder. Instead, I let the digital gates remain wide open, inviting their unvarnished toxicity to flow directly into my evidence cache. My phone vibrated constantly with incoming messages. My mother's texts were a relentless, escalating stream of manufactured crisis and aggressive entitled demands. She berated me for my delayed response regarding the $16,000 dress invoice. She weaponized guilt with surgical precision, claiming my selfishness was actively ruining my sister's happiness and threatening my father's cardiovascular health with unnecessary stress. My father chimed in with brief commanding text messages, ordering me to stop being a burden and to step up for the family. Jamal utilized email, his tone shifting from patronizing corporate jargon to outright thinly veiled extortion. He explicitly hinted that my lack of financial cooperation would result in a permanent family estrangement, a calculated threat designed to leverage my historically desperate need for their approval. Every single message, every demanding voicemail, and every coercive email was immediately captured, timestamped, and archived into my secure server. They genuinely believed they were asserting dominance and pressuring a weak, injured target into submission. In reality, they were systematically documenting their own conspiracy to commit extortion. They were handing me the exact legal ammunition required to prove criminal coercion under federal statutes. To them, I was just a depressed, recovering accident victim, ignoring my phone out of spite. To me, this profound silence was a highly tactical maneuver. I replied only sparingly, offering vague, pathetic apologies about my physical recovery and heavy medication fog, ensuring my responses provided absolutely zero hint of the forensic investigation running in the background. I was the perfect docile mark. The evidence I currently possessed was already sufficient to secure multiple state-level felony convictions. I had the forged documents, the definitive IP, trails, the undeniable medical timeline, and the documented coercion. But a simple state-level fraud case was not my objective. State prosecutors are notoriously overworked, underfunded, and often entirely too willing to offer lenient plea deals for first-time white-collar offenders. Jamal, Brenda, and Thomas would likely secure highly negotiated suspended sentences, claiming financial desperation, temporary insanity, and simple family misunderstandings. That outcome was completely unacceptable. I required the full weight of federal jurisdiction. I needed a crime so severe, so meticulously documented, and so undeniable that it triggered mandatory minimum sentences under federal sentencing guidelines, completely eliminating the possibility of parole. To elevate this from a domestic financial dispute to a federal prosecution, I needed them to cross a specific, irrevocable line. The current structuring of the wire transfers was localized, moving capital between domestic banks within the state lines. I needed them to execute a transaction involving interstate commerce, or better yet, a direct documented wire fraud transmission across federal banking boundaries that unequivocally tied Jamal's illicit operations to my stolen identity. The $16,000 dress invoice was the perfect bait. Jamal was bankrupt, the wedding vendors were demanding final deposits, and my fraudulent credit lines were entirely exhausted. The well was bone dry, but their thirst for capital was peaking at an all-time high. Extreme desperation inevitably breeds extreme recklessness, and a reckless criminal always makes a fatal, unforced error. I sat in the cool blue glow of my office monitors, the trap fully set, the bait dangling perfectly in the water. I did not have to actively hunt them anymore. I just had to sit perfectly still, maintain my absolute silence, and wait for them to make their next inevitably desperate move. The wait lasted exactly 72 hours. The sharp, aggressive pounding on my front door shattered the quiet focus of my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. It was not the polite, rhythmic knock of a delivery driver or a concerned neighbor. It was an entitled, demanding series of strikes that reverberated through the hallway. I meticulously saved my current workflow, locked my encrypted server partitions, and grabbed the handles of my forearm crutches. Hoisting my weight upward sent a blinding flash of agony radiating from my fractured pelvis down through my rigid leg brace, but I welcomed the pain. It sharpened my senses. It anchored me entirely in the present moment. I navigated the short distance to the entryway, the rubber tips of my crutches squeaking faintly against the hardwood floor. When I pulled the heavy door open, I found my mother and father standing on the threshold. Brenda and Thomas were dressed for a country club luncheon they had absolutely no business attending. My mother wore a pastel cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders, her hair freshly blown out, while my father sported a crisp branded golf polo and expensive slacks. They looked like the perfect affluent parents of a blushing bride-to-be. They did not greet me. They did not ask how I was recovering from a near-fatal collision. They did not even flinch when their eyes raked over the heavy titanium locking mechanism bolted to my leg or the dark healing contusion still visible along my jawline. Instead, my mother let out a loud theatrical sigh of pure annoyance as if my shattered bones were nothing more than a deliberate personal inconvenience to her strict schedule. She pushed past me without an invitation, stepping into my foyer, her eyes darting around my apartment with thinly veiled disdain. My father followed closely behind, his posture rigid and authoritative, kicking the door shut with the heel of his loafer. I pivoted awkwardly on my good leg, leaning heavily on my crutches, as they marched straight into my kitchen and took up residence at my dining table. My mother unclasped her designer knockoff handbag and withdrew a thick, stapled document. She tossed it onto the glass surface of the table with a heavy thud. It was a master vendor agreement. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It belonged to one of the most exclusive, outrageously expensive luxury event planning firms on the Eastern Seaboard, a company famous for importing out-of-season botanicals and orchestrating multi-course Michelin star-quality dining experiences for elite clientele. She demanded I sit down and read the signature page. Her tone was completely devoid of maternal warmth, entirely transactional and dripping with impatience. She explicitly stated that the wedding was less than a month away, and the vendors were threatening to cancel the entire event by close of business if the final massive deposits were not secured. She claimed with a perfectly straight face that she and my father were experiencing a temporary, highly frustrating freeze on their liquid assets. She regurgitated Jamal's fabricated corporate buzzwords flawlessly, asserting that their wealth management portfolio was locked in a routine compliance audit, making it impossible for them to release the necessary capital in time to satisfy the caterer and the florist. The sheer unadulterated audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I knew exactly why their credit was locked. They had completely exhausted their own meager limits, and they had violently tapped out the $120,000 they had successfully stolen from my identity. There was no more capital to extract. The digital wells were bone dry. My father stepped forward, towering over the table, tapping a heavy gold-plated pen against the vendor agreement. He instructed me to sign the document immediately as a financial guarantor. He framed it as a minor, inconsequential formality. He insisted it was merely a temporary bridge loan, a signature that would hold the vendors at bay for a few short weeks until their imaginary offshore yields officially cleared. If I signed as the guarantor, I would become legally personally responsible for the entire remaining balance of the extravagant wedding. I would be legally binding myself to tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest corporate debt. I stared at the paperwork, maintaining a mask of weary, medicated confusion. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, adjusting my crutches, and quietly refused. I told them my medical bills were mounting, and I simply did not have the financial bandwidth to guarantee a luxury catering contract. The atmosphere in this kitchen instantly shifted from patronizing impatience to vicious, unfiltered hostility. The mask of the affluent, loving parents melted away entirely. My father slammed his palms down flat against the glass table, leaning his upper body toward me. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He told me I was being an ungrateful, selfish daughter who was actively attempting to sabotage my sister's future out of pure, bitter jealousy. Then he dropped the hammer. He delivered the exact calculated threat that I needed to seal my federal dossier. Thomas squared his shoulders and informed me that if I did not pick up the pen and execute the guarantor agreement immediately, he would make a phone call to the State Board of Accountancy. He stated, his voice laced with cold, deliberate malice, that he and my mother would file a formal sworn medical grievance against my professional license. They would claim that my recent horrific traffic accident had resulted in severe, undocumented traumatic brain injuries. They would officially report that I was experiencing extreme cognitive decline, memory loss, and erratic, unstable behavior. He promised to leverage my physical trauma to convince the licensing board that I was completely mentally unfit to handle sensitive financial data or manage corporate ledgers. He threatened to force a mandatory, grueling psychological evaluation that would immediately suspend my certified public accountant license. He looked me dead in the eyes and swore he would systematically obliterate the career I had spent a decade building, stripping away my entire livelihood and destroying my professional reputation simply because I refused to finance Jamal's fraudulent fantasy. The blackmail was absolute. It was explicit, recorded clearly in my mind, and utterly undeniable. They were attempting to extort me for financial gain by threatening the total destruction of my professional livelihood. They had just crossed the final threshold, moving from covert identity theft to overt, aggressive extortion. They believed they were backing a crippled, exhausted animal into an inescapable corner. They believed the threat of losing my hard-earned career would shatter my resolve and force my compliance. They did not realize they had just handed me the final devastating piece of ammunition I needed. I looked at the pen resting on the glass table. I looked at my mother's impatient, calculating eyes. I looked at my father's aggressive, domineering posture. I let out a slow, defeated breath, playing the role of the terrified, cornered victim perfectly. I reached for the pen, my hand trembling just enough to sell the performance, and pulled the contract toward me. I was not surrendering. I was simply tying the noose they had so eagerly provided. I gripped the heavy gold-plated pen they had slammed on the table, but then intentionally let it slip from my trembling fingers. It clattered against the glass. I let my shoulders collapse inward, bowing my head to allow my hair to obscure my face as I forced a ragged, wet gasp from my chest. I needed them to witness total, unconditional surrender. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing hot tears to spill over my lashes and trace the healing bruises on my cheeks. I choked out a pathetic, fractured apology, letting my voice crack and waver with manufactured terror. I told them they had won. I sobbed that I could not lose my professional certification, crying that my career was the absolute only thing I had left in the world. I begged them not to call the State Board of Accountancy. The sheer pathetic nature of my performance was nauseating, twisting my stomach into tight knots, but I leaned into the humiliation, amplifying the desperation, until I sounded completely unhinged. I stammered that I would guarantee the luxury catering contract I would take on the crushing corporate debt they were forcing upon me, but I needed one single concession in return. I looked up at my mother, my expression a carefully crafted portrait of a desperate, longing child seeking validation. I told her that if I was going to finance this extravagant masterpiece, I wanted to be there to witness it. I demanded a front row seat at the ceremony. I wept, claiming that surviving the accident had made me realize how brief and fragile life truly was, and that I just wanted to see my sister walk down the aisle in all her glory. I wanted to be in the family photographs. I wanted to finally truly feel like I belonged to them, like I was a real part of the family instead of an outsider. The transformation in my parents was instantaneous and deeply revolting. The vicious cornered animal aggression evaporated entirely, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, triumphant condescension. My mother's rigid posture relaxed, and a smug, victorious smile spread across her flawlessly made-up face. She reached out and patted my trembling hand, her touch feeling like an insect crawling across my skin. She cooed that she always knew I would eventually do the right thing and step up for my sister's big day. My father chuckled a low, booming sound of pure, unfiltered arrogance. He praised my sudden maturity, assuring me that there would be a prime seat waiting for me right behind the altar. They bought the illusion completely. Their inherent narcissism blinded them to any possibility of deception. They believed my tears were born of defeat, not tactical adrenaline. I pushed their gold pen away, citing the lingering nerve damage in my arm from the vehicular crash. I claimed my grip strength was far too weak to press through the thick carbon copies of the physical contract they had brought. Instead, I offered a modern, seamless alternative. I pulled my secure professional tablet and its paired digital stylus from the kitchen island. I explained that the elite catering firm accepted encrypted electronic authorizations, which was perfectly standard procedure for high-level corporate agreements. My father, impatient to secure his financial prize, waved away the technical details and simply tapped his thick finger against the glowing screen, demanding I finalize the execution immediately. I pressed the stylus to the illuminated glass. What Brenda and Thomas failed to comprehend was the underlying architectural reality of the software I had just activated. This was not a standard commercial document viewer. It was a proprietary forensic auditing application designed for stringent federal compliance and evidence collection. As the tip of the stylus glided across the signature line, the program silently executed a background security protocol. It did not merely capture the biometric pressure and vector graphics of my signature. It embedded an immutable, trackable cryptographic token directly into the metadata of the digital file. This tracking protocol instantly harvested the exact geospatial coordinates of my apartment, the synchronized atomic time, and the specific media access control address of the routing hardware we were connected to. More importantly, it routed the authorization through an out-of-state server, instantly elevating the transaction to an interstate wire transmission. I was creating a legally binding, mathematically undeniable chain of custody. By coercing me to sign this specific digital packet under the explicit verbal threat of destroying my professional license, they were permanently anchoring their extortion to a federal digital framework. The document compiled itself, hashing the data into a secure block that could never be altered, deleted, or challenged by defense attorneys in a court of law. I hit submit. A soft, pleasant chime confirmed the outbound transmission. My father snatched the printed copies from the table, no longer needing them, but treating them like conquered trophies regardless. My mother adjusted her cashmere cardigan, her eyes gleaming with unearned triumph and superiority. She offered a final, patronizing reminder to buy a dress that would not clash with the bridal party's curated color palette. They turned their backs and walked out of my apartment, their heads held high, the heavy front door clicking shut behind them. The instant the brass latch engaged, my tears vanished. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I stood up straight, ignoring the dull, throbbing ache in my fractured pelvis. I wiped the dampness from my face with the back of my sleeve, feeling a cold, razor-sharp clarity wash over my mind. They walked to the elevator, utterly convinced they had broken me into complete submission, completely unaware they had just hand-delivered the final, inescapable piece of evidence required for a sweeping federal indictment. The extortion was now fully documented, the interstate wire fraud was mathematically proven, and the trap was locked irreversibly tight. They had secured their luxury catering, but they had paid for it with their freedom. 48 hours later, I navigated my modified vehicle through the heavy concrete barricades of the Federal Plaza downtown. My injured leg throbbed with every press of the specialized pedals, a dull, rhythmic reminder of the physical toll this ordeal had exacted, but adrenaline kept my mind razor-sharp. Tucked safely on the passenger seat was a heavy, reinforced briefcase. It contained a comprehensive physical ledger, multiple encrypted solid-state drives, and sworn affidavits detailing the entire scope of the criminal enterprise. I was not walking into the lobby cold, hoping to catch the attention of a random duty officer. During my years as a forensic auditor, tracking illicit funds across international borders, I had cultivated relationships with specific investigators who specialized in dismantling complex white-collar syndicates. I had utilized a secure channel to request an emergency summit with Special Agent Corcoran of the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force and Chief Inspector Vance from the United States Postal Inspection Service. The air inside the sterile windowless briefing room smelled of stale coffee ozone and industrial carpet cleaner. Corcoran, a seasoned investigator with sharp analytical eyes that missed nothing, sat across the cold metal table alongside Vance, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a ruthless efficiency. They had expected a routine consultation regarding a mid-level corporate embezzlement case, the kind of standard fraud I typically flagged for their departments. Instead, I unlatched my briefcase and began dealing out the destruction of my family like a deck of marked cards. I laid out the initial identity theft architecture, showing exactly how Jamal had exploited my parents' proximity to my private records. I did not focus on the emotional betrayal or the psychological abuse. Federal agents do not prosecute hurt feelings. I focused strictly on the mechanics of the wire fraud. I projected the complex IP routing maps onto the room's high-definition display screen. I walked them through the geospatial coordinates, demonstrating how the fraudulent loan applications originated directly from Brenda and Thomas's suburban router, bypassing standard security protocols. Then I revealed the money laundering methodology. I showed them the structured transfers, the meticulous drip feed of capital designed specifically to evade federal reporting thresholds. I detailed how they utilized a network of seemingly legitimate shell corporations to wash the funds before distributing them to the wedding vendors. But Jamal's operation extended far beyond a single compromised credit line. Utilizing the backdoor access he had inadvertently granted me through his careless secondary verification numbers, I had mapped his broader network. He was operating a sophisticated synthetic identity ring, fabricating pristine credit profiles using stolen social security numbers merged with fictitious addresses. He was systematically targeting the elderly, the disabled, and the financially vulnerable. My parents were merely his latest, most lucrative mules-willing accomplices who provided him with a high-value target in exchange for funding their desperate social ambitions. Inspector Vance leaned forward, tracing the flow of funds with his pen, his expression hardening as he grasped the sheer scale of the fraud. Because Jamal had utilized the mail system to receive the physical credit cards and bank statements at a series of ghost addresses, he had triggered severe federal mail fraud statutes. Corcoran scrutinized the digital track-and-trace signature I had extracted from the catering contract. The cryptographic token was a silver bullet. It proved unequivocally that Brenda and Thomas had utilized coercion to force an interstate wire authorization, upgrading their involvement from simple accomplices to primary conspirators in a federal extortion plot. The metadata was indisputable, locking their physical location timestamp and malicious intent into a digital vault that no defense attorney could ever breach. The room fell into a heavy, profound silence as the agents absorbed the sheer volume and perfection of the intelligence. They were accustomed to chasing shadows, spending months subpoenaing banking records, battling through offshore proxy servers, and fighting jurisdictional red tape just to identify suspects. I had just handed them a fully assembled prosecution-ready puzzle with every piece securely glued into place. Corcoran rubbed his jaw, shaking his head in mild disbelief. He admitted that they rarely saw a victim independently construct a case that practically guaranteed a grand jury indictment on the first pass. He called it a prosecutor's absolute dream, an airtight labyrinth of forensic evidence that left absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. But the dossier was only the setup. I needed to control the execution. I pulled up the final spreadsheet highlighting a pending transaction scheduled in the master catering and venue contract. The initial deposits they had coerced out of me had merely secured the date and the physical location. The remaining balance, a massive balloon payment of exactly $80,000, was contractually obligated to be processed at the very height of the celebration. The vendors required the funds to clear their merchant accounts before the cake was cut and the champagne toast concluded. Jamal had carefully scheduled the final wire transfer from the compromised accounts to hit the venue's corporate ledger at 8 o'clock on the evening of the reception. I looked at Corcoran and Vance laying out the ultimate strategic strike. If we froze the accounts immediately, Jamal would sense the disruption. His internal alarm system would trigger, he would abort the transfer, and he would vanish into the criminal underground before the ink on a federal warrant could dry. My parents would play the fools, claiming they were innocent victims of his scam entirely duped by a charismatic con artist. To capture the entire syndicate together, undeniably linked by the final massive interstate wire transfer, we had to let the transaction initiate. We had to let them celebrate their stolen victory right up until the exact second the money moved. The agents grasped the tactical brilliance of the timing. A coordinated strike during the reception would catch Jamal physically present with his co-conspirators, surrounded by the illicitly obtained luxury goods and services funded by the wire fraud. It would provide irrefutable circumstantial evidence of their mutual enrichment from the crime in progress. Corcoran initiated a secure call to the United States Attorney's Office, right there from the briefing room, fast-tracking the sealed indictments and coordinating a joint task force response. Vance began mobilizing a team of postal inspectors to secure Jamal's ghost addresses, simultaneously ensuring his entire synthetic network would be dismantled in one devastating swoop. They agreed to my terms without a single moment of hesitation. The trap would remain perfectly still for 3 more weeks. The federal net would hang invisibly above the lavish ballroom, waiting for the precise moment the $80,000 wire transfer hit the federal banking switch. My parents wanted a front-row seat to their manufactured high society triumph. They were going to get one surrounded by federal agents, flashing lights, and the absolute destruction of their meticulously crafted facade. I snapped my briefcase shut, the heavy metal latches echoing like a judge's gavel in the quiet room. The preparation was entirely complete. The only thing left to do was attend a wedding. The 3 weeks evaporated into a tense, vibrating silence. When the designated Saturday finally arrived, I drove my modified vehicle through the heavy wrought iron gates of the Chateau Bellevue, a historic, sprawling country estate nestled deep within the state's most exclusive zip code. This was not merely a wedding venue, it was a highly fortified compound of inherited wealth and architectural arrogance renting for an astronomical daily premium. I surrendered my keys to a white-gloved valet and retrieved my titanium forearm crutches from the passenger seat. I had completely ignored my mother's patronizing directives regarding the bridal party's designated pastel color palette. Instead of blending into the sickening sea of blush pinks, seafoam greens, and muted lavender, I wore a sharply tailored midnight black power suit. The dark structured wool was my armor. It cut a harsh, striking silhouette against the fever dream unfolding across the manicured lawns. Every step I took toward the grand pavilion was a synchronized squeak of rubber on imported stone, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat announcing my arrival. I bypassed the greeting line and stepped directly into the grand foyer, immediately assaulted by the sheer, unadulterated scale of the financial hemorrhage. The stolen capital had been transmuted into a sensory overload of grotesque extravagance. Thousands of rare imported white orchids hung inverted from the vaulted ceilings, creating a dense, suffocating floral canopy that smelled faintly of vanilla and wasted credit. Flanking the entrance to the main ballroom were twin, life-sized ice sculptures depicting swans in mid-flight, slowly weeping chilled water into illuminated crystal basins. In the absolute center of the reception space stood a towering, multi-tiered champagne fountain, already flowing constantly with a vintage reserve. Crystal flutes caught the afternoon sunlight, refracting tiny blinding rainbows across the polished marble floors. It was a masterpiece of manufactured high society, a flawless, million-dollar illusion financed entirely by my stolen future and Jamal's illicit digital keystrokes. I navigated the perimeter of the room, blending into the shadows of the massive floral arrangements to observe the architects of this theft. Jamal was in his absolute element. He stood near the open mahogany bar, nursing a heavy tumbler of top-shelf bourbon, holding court among a wide circle of clearly impressed extended family members and naive college acquaintances. He was playing the role of the affluent visionary tech investor to absolute perfection. I watched his hands move expansively as he spun fabricated tales of aggressive portfolio growth, offshore venture capital acquisitions, and phantom startup valuations. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly, laughing loudly at his own jokes, exuding the magnetic toxic charisma of a predator who firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire federal banking system. He possessed the terrifying, unshakable confidence of a man entirely convinced his synthetic reality was bulletproof. A few yards away, Brenda and Thomas were executing their own nauseating performance. They drifted through the assembly of wealthy guests like seasoned aristocrats holding a royal court. My mother clutched a crystal champagne flute, her posture rigidly aligned, nodding with profound artificial grace as guests complimented the breathtaking decor. She wore an expensive, heavily beaded designer gown that caught the ambient light, actively absorbing the praise for a luxury she had orchestrated through identity theft and familial extortion. My father stood right beside her, utilizing his booming, authoritative voice to command the attention of anyone within a 10-foot radius. He clapped men on the shoulder, offering unsolicited, arrogant advice on wealth management and commercial property investments, projecting the aura of a self-made titan of industry. They were practically vibrating with unearned arrogance, entirely intoxicated by the social elevation their crimes had blindly purchased. They truly believed they had arrived at the pinnacle of their suburban dreams, successfully crushing my independence beneath their polished heels to get there. I did not engage with them. I did not offer fake smiles or forced hollow congratulations. Instead, I moved silently toward the outdoor ceremony space, overlooking the estate's private, glittering lake. The seating arrangement was a masterpiece of strict social hierarchy, and true to their word, my parents had secured my placement. I found the gold-embossed place card bearing my name resting on the padded velvet cushion of a gilded chair directly in the front row, just inches from the flower-draped altar. It was the ultimate seat of honor granted to me as a twisted reward for my forced financial submission. I lowered myself into the chair, adjusting the locking hinge on my leg brace, and rested my hands over the ergonomic grips of my crutches. Sitting there in the brilliant afternoon sun, I surveyed the delicate house of cards they had built around me. A live string quartet began to play a soft classical melody, signaling the beginning of the bridal procession. Guests took their assigned seats, whispering excitedly about the sheer beauty of the estate and the obvious staggering wealth required to secure it. I remained perfectly still, a silent, dark predator resting patiently among the flock. I watched Jamal take his place at the front of the aisle, adjusting his diamond cufflinks with a smug, satisfied grin. I watched my parents take their seats across from me, radiating absolute triumph. When they looked my way, they saw a broken, compliant daughter who had finally bent to their superior will. They saw a helpless victim forced to witness their ultimate victory. They could not see the encrypted countdown timer currently running on my secured mobile device safely tucked inside the inner pocket of my dark jacket. They did not know that less than 3 miles away, a heavily armed fleet of unmarked black tactical vehicles was staging in a discreet commercial parking lot. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Special Agent Corcoran and Inspector Vance were actively monitoring the exact federal banking node that would soon process their final $80,000 balloon payment. I watched them celebrate their stolen luxury, feeling no anger, no sorrow, and no pity. The time for emotional reactions had died in my intensive care bed months ago. Now there was only the cold mechanical precision of the impending strike. I fixed my gaze on the altar, listening to the music swell over the water, and waited for the invisible federal net to drop over the entire immaculate illusion. The ceremony concluded in a flurry of orchestrated perfection. A shower of imported white rose petals rained down on the newly pronounced husband and wife as they marched back up the aisle, their faces locked in matching expressions of ecstatic triumph. I remained in my gold-embossed seat until the primary crush of guests had filtered toward the cocktail hour, letting the chaotic sea of pastel silk and linen part around me. Only when the lawn began to empty did I hoist myself upward, my joints screaming in protest, and begin the slow, squeaking trek toward the grand ballroom where the reception was slated to begin. The transition space between the outdoor pavilion and the main hall was a gauntlet of aggressively curated wealth. Waitstaff circulated with silver platters of seared wagyu and beluga caviar, navigating past towering floral installations that seemed to multiply by the hour. I found a quiet alcove near the entrance of the ballroom, leaning my weight against a cool marble pillar to give my shattered pelvis a momentary reprieve. Through the massive open French doors, I could see the reception space had been transformed into a nightclub for the elite. Chandeliers draped in spun glass cast a warm golden glow over 80 perfectly symmetrical tables, each adorned with centerpieces so tall they threatened to graze the painted ceiling. I watched the crowd mingle, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when the bride finally made her grand entrance into the foyer. Brittany looked like she had been carved from ivory and spun sugar. She was wearing a custom hand-stitched couture gown that Jamal had proudly announced cost $16,000 during a particularly boastful dinner weeks ago. It was a chaotic masterpiece of French lace, cascading silk tulle, and thousands of hand-placed Swarovski crystals that caught the ambient light like a shattered disco ball. She moved through the room with practiced gliding steps, accepting the fawning adoration of the crowd with the serene entitlement of a reigning monarch. She looked flawless, untouched by the absolute devastation her lifestyle was currently funding. Then her eyes locked onto mine. The serene, glowing bridal mask vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, familiar glare of absolute irritation. She excused herself from a circle of Jamal's supposed venture capital partners and altered her trajectory, charting a direct course for my secluded alcove. As she approached, the sheer volume of her dress forced a physical perimeter, the heavy silk whispering against the marble floor like a warning. She stopped just inches from my face, invading my personal space to ensure our conversation remained entirely private. Up close, the heavy application of her flawless makeup could not hide the frantic, manic energy vibrating behind her eyes. She did not ask about my injured leg. She did not thank me for securing the financial lifeline that was currently paying for the caviar melting on the tongues of her guests. She did not show a shred of gratitude for the professional blackmail I had endured to make this very moment possible. Instead, she looked me up and down, her gaze raking over my dark tailored wool suit and the heavy titanium framework of my forearm crutches with unfiltered visceral disdain. She let out a sharp, irritated breath, a sound I had heard 1,000 times throughout our childhood whenever I had failed to align with her aesthetic vision. She leaned in close, the scent of her custom-blended perfume cloying and suffocating, and dropped her voice into a venomous, hissing whisper. She informed me that my appearance was a complete and utter disaster. She stated with brutal, calculated precision that my depressing funeral-ready suit was a deliberate insult to her carefully planned color palette. She accused me of intentionally trying to sabotage her wedding photographs by standing around like a grim metallic gargoyle, while everyone else was radiating joy and affluent elegance. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the rubber tips of my crutches, her face twisting in pure disgust, and told me they were an absolute eyesore that was actively ruining the high society ambiance she and Jamal had worked so hard to cultivate. The audacity was breathtaking, yet entirely expected. She wasn't finished. Brittany squared her shoulders, her $16,000 dress rustling aggressively, and issued a direct, non-negotiable command. She ordered me to abandon my assigned seat near the head table. She explicitly instructed me to navigate to the furthest, darkest back corner of the reception hall and remain there for the duration of the evening. She demanded that I stay completely out of sight, away from the roaming videographers, and most importantly, away from Jamal's important, wealthy guests. She insisted that my crippled, miserable presence was an embarrassment she simply could not afford to manage on her special day, framing my physical trauma as a personal attack against her social standing. She stood there practically trembling with self-righteous vanity, waiting for me to bow my head and quietly accept my banishment to the shadows. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my physical limitations and my social inferiority compared to her glittering triumph. I did not look away. I did not shrink back or offer the wounded defensive apology she was so desperately craving. The cold, mechanical clarity that had carried me through the Federal Plaza anchored me perfectly in this moment. I looked at the glittering crystals sewn into the bodice of her stolen gown. I looked at the frantic, shallow vanity burning in her eyes. I felt the encrypted timer ticking down on the mobile device in my jacket pocket, counting the minutes until the digital wire transfer initiated the collapse of her entire universe. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission, nor was it the fragile, tearful grin she had witnessed in my apartment. It was the warm, relaxed expression of someone who already knows the ending of the movie. I casually shifted my weight, the metal joints of my leg brace clicking softly as I adjusted my right forearm crutch. I leaned forward, closing the final inch of space between us, and met her hostile glare with absolute, unwavering serenity. I whispered back, keeping my voice light, breezy, and dripping with an almost maternal sense of reassurance. I told her not to worry about a single thing. I promised her that by the end of the night, no one will be looking at me. Brittany blinked momentarily, thrown off balance by my cheerful compliance. Her brow furrowed in brief confusion, searching my face for sarcasm or defiance, but finding only a calm, placid mask. She lacked the depth to look past the surface of the words. To her, it was a total victory, a final confirmation of her dominance. She let out a short, triumphant huff, satisfied that she had successfully managed the unsightly complication I presented. She turned on her heel, her massive train sweeping across the floor, and marched back toward the champagne fountain to rejoin her glittering, fraudulent kingdom. I watched her walk away, my smile never fading, knowing that my promise was the truest thing she would hear all day. The music swelled, transitioning seamlessly from the subdued classical quartet that accompanied the ceremony into a roaring, high-octane brass and percussion ensemble that practically vibrated the crystal fixtures suspended overhead. This sonic shift signaled the official commencement of the evening's uninhibited excess. 300 impeccably dressed guests flooded the polished mahogany dance floor, their laughter blending with the sharp, syncopated rhythm of the driving bass line. The atmosphere was nothing short of electric, thick with the heavy scent of roasted meats, imported spices, and those exorbitant, suffocating floral arrangements. Waitstaff in pristine white coats navigated the swirling crowd with the flawless precision of a military drill team, guaranteeing that no guest ever held an empty glass for more than a fraction of a second. Top-shelf liquor flowed in a continuous golden river across the massive ice bars. Bottles of rare, vintage champagne were uncorked with rhythmic celebratory pops, the sparkling liquid cascading down the towering crystal fountain with reckless, arrogant abandon. It was a dizzying sensory overload of manufactured bliss, a perfect counterfeit reality operating at maximum velocity. I maintained my rigid posture in the dim periphery, a silent specter haunting the edges of their glittering masquerade. I leaned heavily against the cool marble pillar, watching the frenetic energy of the room swirl around me, perfectly content to remain entirely unseen while the clock ticked down. Across the expanse of the ballroom, Jamal was holding court near the raw seafood station, a fresh cocktail loosely gripped in his hand, and a captive audience of my father's business associates hanging on his every fabricated word. He threw his head back in laughter, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile that belonged on the cover of a magazine. He was the absolute center of gravity in the room, basking in the warm, blinding glow of his successful deception. Then the invisible gears of the financial machine finally caught and ground to a violent, sickening halt. I tracked the rapid movement of the estate's senior event director as he sliced through the dense crowd. The director was a towering, severe man who moved with absolute, uncompromising authority, entirely immune to the intoxicating atmosphere of the party. He approached Jamal from the side, leaning in close to murmur something discreetly near his ear. Jamal's initial reaction was pure dismissive arrogance. He waved his hand in a short batting motion, attempting to brush the manager away like a pesky insect, clearly annoyed by the mundane interruption of his grand performance. But the director did not retreat. He stepped directly into Jamal's personal space, his face a rigid mask of professional urgency, and spoke again, his posture demanding immediate compliance. This time the words landed with the force of a physical blow. The easy, confident smile instantly vanished from Jamal's face, replaced by a rigid, hollow stare of pure shock. He excused himself from his adoring circle of guests with a stiff, jerky nod, his movements suddenly robbed of their liquid grace. He followed the estate director away from the pulsating music and the flashing lights, stepping into a quiet, shadowed corridor leading toward the venue's administrative suites. I adjusted my stance, pivoting slightly on my crutches to keep their retreating figures in my direct line of sight. Behind the heavy, soundproofed doors of the back office, the financial illusion was shattering into jagged, irreparable pieces. The venue's automated billing system had just attempted to execute the final contractual sweep for the remaining $80,000 balance. The transaction had not merely bounced due to insufficient funds or a routine daily limit hold. The merchant terminal had thrown back a hard, unyielding error code, a specific severe alphanumeric sequence that indicated the account was completely locked under a federal fraud investigation. The digital well was not just dry, it was surrounded by virtual crime scene tape. From my vantage point, catching glimpses through the narrow vertical window of the office door whenever a staff member passed through, I watched the physical manifestation of Jamal's panic. The smooth, unflappable tech investor dissolved into a cornered, desperate grifter right before my eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke tuxedo and produced a thick leather wallet, withdrawing a sleek, heavy metal credit card linked to one of his pristine synthetic identities. He handed it to the director, his mouth moving in rapid, frantic explanations demanding they run the transaction manually. The director swiped the magnetic stripe through the terminal. The machine beeped a flat, mechanical rejection. Jamal's hands began to shake visibly. He pulled a second card, a premium platinum account he had drained from a vulnerable retiree weeks prior, and shoved it across the desk. The terminal rejected it instantly. A thick bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the office. He produced a third card, his movements erratic and wildly uncoordinated. Declined. The entire network of stolen identities, shell accounts, and laundered funds had been simultaneously frozen, severed from the banking grid, in one devastating synchronized strike. Jamal burst back out of the office doors, his chest heaving, his immaculate tuxedo suddenly looking suffocatingly tight across his shoulders. He scanned the crowded ballroom with wide, terrified eyes, the booming music and joyous laughter now mocking his impending destruction. He spotted Brenda and Thomas standing near the towering champagne fountain, toasting their fabricated success with absolute glee. Jamal sprinted toward them, completely abandoning any pretense of high society elegance. He collided with my father, his fingers digging fiercely into Thomas's shoulder, the sudden impact causing champagne to slosh over the rim of my mother's crystal flute and stain her expensive silk wrap. Brenda's face twisted in outrage at the clumsy interruption, but her annoyance instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror as Jamal leaned in and delivered the news. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack, and the authoritative posture he had projected all evening collapsed like a punctured lung. Brenda's hand flew to her throat, her eyes darting frantically around the room, as if expecting the gilded ceiling to cave in on them. Jamal did not wait for their questions. He grabbed them both by the arms, his grip bruising and desperate, and physically dragged them away from the glittering fountain, hauling them toward the isolated administrative corridor to face the reality of their ruined scheme. I watched their panicked, stumbling retreat from my quiet alcove. The music roared on, the guests continued to dance, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial meltdown occurring just feet away. I raised my glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. I took a slow, deliberate sip, the cold liquid soothing my dry throat, and watched the absolute destruction of their empire unfold in real time. The heavy oak doors of the administrative suite had not fully latched shut behind their panicked retreat, leaving a narrow, vertical sliver of negative space. I pushed off the cool marble pillar, my rubber crutch tips squeaking faintly against the polished floor, and moved stealthily toward the gap. The booming bass from the grand ballroom provided a perfect acoustic cover for my approach, masking the mechanical click of my leg brace. I positioned myself just outside the threshold, perfectly cloaked in the dim, ambient lighting of the secluded corridor. Through the slight opening, the scene unfolding inside the stark, fluorescent-lit office was a masterpiece of human desperation. The estate director stood behind a heavy mahogany desk, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute, immovable authority. Jamal was pacing the length of the room like a caged, terrified animal, running his hands frantically over his closely cropped hair, his bespoke tuxedo jacket already discarded on a nearby leather chair. My father stepped forward, desperately attempting to reclaim the commanding, aristocratic presence he had projected all evening. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie with a trembling hand, and cleared his throat loudly to command the room. He reached into his tailored slacks and produced a sleek, heavy platinum credit card. I recognized the metallic sheen instantly from the financial files Corcoran had shown me. It was the primary physical backup, the absolute crown jewel of their fraudulent empire, secured entirely against my stolen social security number and my previously pristine credit history. Thomas slid the card across the polished mahogany surface with a forced, arrogant chuckle. He instructed the director to run the balance immediately and generously offered to add a 10% gratuity for the minor technical inconvenience. The director picked up the card, his expression betraying a deep, professional skepticism, and swiped it firmly through the heavy terminal resting on his desk. The machine did not issue the standard momentary beep of a simple decline or a communication error. Instead, it emitted a sharp, sustained, high-pitched alarm that pierced the tense silence of the room like a siren. The terminal screen flared a brilliant, angry red. The director leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses, and read the flashing text aloud. The display did not indicate insufficient funds or a temporary security hold. It displayed a terrifying, unequivocal federal code indicating that the account was locked, the assets were actively seized by the United States Department of the Treasury, and the physical card itself was a flagged instrument of a major criminal investigation. The director's professional demeanor transformed instantly. The polite, accommodating hospitality manager vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a hardened, furious businessman who suddenly realized he was harboring a syndicate of desperate grifters. He dropped the seized platinum card onto the desk as if it were coated in toxic waste. Reaching for the two-way radio clipped to his belt, he pressed the transmission button and barked a series of sharp, decisive orders to his floor staff. 10 seconds later, the pulsating dance music in the grand ballroom abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was absolute and deafening, followed immediately by a collective, confused murmur rising from 300 highly intoxicated guests. The director then locked eyes with my father, delivering a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. He stated, his voice dripping with venom, that they had exactly 10 minutes to produce a valid, verifiable wire transfer from a legitimate banking institution. If the funds did not clear his account within that precise shrinking time frame, he was pulling the main electrical breakers to the ballroom. He promised to instruct his catering staff to immediately wheel every cart of imported food back into the industrial kitchen and lock the reinforced doors. Finally, he assured them that at the 10-minute mark, he would personally dial the local authorities and report a massive organized theft of services, ensuring no one left the premises before the squad cars arrived. The absolute finality of the director's threat shattered their fragile criminal alliance. The synchronized illusion of family wealth and unshakable confidence disintegrated into a vicious, feral battle for survival. Jamal spun around, his eyes wild and unhinged, and launched a verbal assault directly at my parents. He pointed an accusatory, shaking finger at Thomas, his voice cracking with sheer panic, screaming that my father had promised the backup accounts were clean and untraceable. He blamed Brenda for insisting on the exorbitant imported orchids and the ridiculous champagne fountain that had pushed the final balance past their safety threshold. My father shouted back, his face flushing a dangerous apoplectic shade of crimson, accusing Jamal of sloppy digital hygiene and demanding to know how the federal government had tracked the encrypted offshore nodes. Brenda did not yell. Her carefully maintained high society posture collapsed entirely. She gripped the edge of a metal filing cabinet, her knuckles turning white, and began taking rapid, shallow gasps of air. Her chest heaved dramatically as a full-blown panic attack took root the beaded bodice of her designer gown, catching the harsh fluorescent light with every erratic wheezing breath. The vicious screaming match was suddenly amplified by the violent swinging open of the office door. Brittany burst into the small room, her massive $16,000 wedding gown catching and tearing slightly on the wooden doorframe. Her perfect, serene bridal composure was completely obliterated. Her face was flushed, her expensive makeup beginning to run down her cheeks, and she shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why the band had stopped playing, and why the bartenders were currently packing up the top-shelf liquor. Jamal turned to his new bride, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender, and confessed that the money was entirely gone. Brittany let out a guttural, terrifying wail that rattled the office windows. The fairy tale wedding dissolved into a chaotic, vicious brawl right before my eyes. Brittany lunged at Jamal, her manicured nails flashing under the harsh lights, screaming that he had ruined her perfect day and destroyed her life. Thomas was shouting over the deafening din, frantically dialing numbers on his mobile phone that were already dead and disconnected. Brenda sank slowly to the carpeted floor, weeping hysterically and hyperventilating into her manicured hands. I stood motionless in the shadowed corridor, listening to the symphony of their total destruction, my heartbeat steady, my breathing calm, and my revenge unfolding with absolute flawless precision. The heavy wooden door to the administrative suite buckled inward before anyone inside could draw another hysterical breath. A deafening localized crash eclipsed the screaming match as four heavily armored tactical officers breached the threshold. Their entry was a masterclass in kinetic violence, pouring into the confined space with weapons raised and blinding lights cutting through the dim office. The command was sharp, guttural, and left no room for negotiation. "Federal agents, get on the ground. Keep your hands where we can see them." The sheer velocity of the raid instantly neutralized the family brawl. Jamal's survival instinct flickered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward a secondary exit, but a laser sight painted the center of his chest before his muscles could even twitch. He collapsed to his knees, throwing his arms over his head, the bespoke tuxedo pants tearing on the coarse carpet. My father did not attempt to flee. Thomas simply froze, his mouth hanging open in a silent, grotesque mask of absolute terror, his arms suspended mid-air as two officers slammed him face first against the mahogany desk. The expensive platinum card he had tried to pass off mere minutes ago was knocked to the floor, trampled under the heavy tread of combat boots. Brenda's panic attack abruptly transformed into a shrill, hyperventilating screech. An officer gripped her by the shoulders, forcefully guiding her down, pinning her heavily beaded designer gown against the floorboards. Brittany, still tangled in her $16,000 wedding dress, backed away until she hit the metal filing cabinets, her hands raised in utter bewilderment. She shrieked that there was a mistake, that she was the bride, that they were ruining her reception. An agent swiftly secured her wrists behind her back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing sharply over her frantic protests. The pristine white silk of her skirt was instantly smeared with dirt from the boots of the arresting officers. I remained perfectly still in the corridor, pressing my back against the cool marble to give the advancing assault team a clear vector. A tall figure stepped past the tactical unit and crossed the threshold into the ruined office. Special Agent Corcoran surveyed the carnage with cold, professional satisfaction. He wore a dark windbreaker with federal block lettering emblazoned across the back, holding a thick manila folder that undoubtedly contained the meticulously documented evidence of their entire synthetic empire. Corcoran did not shout. He spoke in a measured, icy baritone that sliced right through the chaotic whimpering of the prisoners. He announced the charges listing wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and federal conspiracy. He rattled off the specific statutes with lethal precision, each code carrying the weight of decades in a federal penitentiary. He looked directly down at Jamal, whose face was pressed into the carpet, and informed him that the offshore routing nodes had been compromised 3 days prior. The $80,000 balloon payment was a honeypot, an isolated trap designed to trigger the final seizure of all physical and digital assets. Inspector Vance followed closely behind Corcoran, accompanied by a local police detachment. They moved swiftly to secure the perimeter. I stepped out from the shadows, the rubber tips of my crutches squeaking against the marble as I slowly approached the open doorway. The tactical officers had hauled Jamal and my father to their feet, their hands securely bound behind their backs. Brenda was sobbing incoherently, her expensive makeup smeared into dark, ugly streaks across her pale face. When my father saw me standing in the doorway, the confusion in his eyes morphed into a sudden, desperate realization. He looked from me to Agent Corcoran, the pieces of the puzzle finally snapping together in his arrogant mind. The compliance, the silence, the sudden willingness to attend the wedding. It had not been surrender. It had been a firing squad. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch one final venomous accusation, but Vance shoved him forward before a single word could escape his throat. Jamal refused to look at me. His eyes were fixed firmly on the floor, the magnetic charm and toxic confidence entirely evaporated. He was nothing more than a cornered thief stripped of his digital armor. Brittany, however, continued to thrash against the grip of the female officer securing her, her veil hanging askew, crying out that I had done this to them. She screamed that I was a jealous, crippled failure trying to destroy her happiness. Corcoran turned to her, his expression utterly blank, and advised her that anything she said would be recorded and used against her in the upcoming indictment. The threat snapped her jaw shut, leaving only a pathetic, high-pitched whimper in her throat. The procession out of the administrative suite was a brutal march of public humiliation. Corcoran and his team led the 4 handcuffed prisoners down the long corridor and directly into the grand foyer. The 300 guests, having been corralled into the main reception space by local law enforcement, watched in dead, stunned silence. The imported orchids hung overhead like a suffocating canopy. The ice sculptures of the soaring swans were rapidly melting weeping cold water into their illuminated basins. The towering champagne fountain continued to flow, a stark bubbling contrast to the catastrophic ruin unfolding beneath it. I followed at a measured distance. I watched my parents and my sister being paraded in front of their affluent, carefully curated audience. The wealthy venture capitalists, the naive college friends, and the extended family members stared in absolute horror as the architects of this million-dollar illusion were marched toward the exit. The flashing red and blue lights of a dozen federal vehicles painted the pristine white walls of the Chateau Bellevue, bleeding through the massive glass doors. Agent Corcoran paused near the entrance, signaling the tactical unit to proceed with the prisoners. He turned back, waiting for me to catch up. He did not offer a comforting smile or an unnecessary platitude. He simply gave me a short, respectful nod, acknowledging the conclusion of our joint operation. I nodded back, adjusting my grip on the ergonomic handles of my crutches. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the silent, horrified crowd, and watched the heavy wrought iron doors close behind them, permanently sealing them in a reality they could no longer forge. The heavy wrought iron doors of the grand foyer sealed shut with a resonant metallic clang, trapping the echoes of the federal raid inside the vast venue. For several agonizing seconds, a profound and absolute silence reigned over the Chateau Bellevue. The flashing red and blue lights of the tactical cruisers parked outside bled through the towering stained glass windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the polished mahogany dance floor. The 300 guests stood frozen in place, a glittering sea of high society, reduced to a collection of wide-eyed, statuesque mannequins. Then the collective shock broke. A low, frantic murmur rippled through the crowd, building rapidly into a chaotic crescendo of panicked speculation and breathless whispers. Wealthy socialites clutched their designer pearls while sharp-suited men frantically checked their mobile devices, searching for news alerts or emergency financial bulletins. The perfectly orchestrated illusion of affluent celebration had been violently ruptured, leaving a vacuum of pure, unfiltered confusion in its wake. I turned away from this barricaded entrance, my gaze sweeping across the bewildered assembly. The live band, positioned on a raised velvet-draped stage at the far end of the ballroom, had stopped playing the moment the agents breached the administrative suite. The lead singer stood completely paralyzed, his hands hanging limply by his sides, staring blankly at the vacant dance floor. A single focused spotlight still illuminated the center stage, cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the hall like a beacon. It was the perfect platform. I adjusted my grip on the ergonomic handles of my titanium crutches and began a slow, deliberate march toward the riser. The sharp squeak of my rubber crutch tips against the marble floor cut through the rising din of the crowd. As I advanced, the sea of bewildered guests naturally parted before me. They pulled back their heavy silk dresses and tailored wool jackets, granting me a wide, unobstructed path. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and intense curiosity, entirely unaware that the crippled woman navigating their ranks was the sole architect of the federal raid they had just witnessed. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the rhythmic mechanical click of my leg brace serve as a steady metronome for the unfolding drama. Every step was a testament to my survival, a physical reclamation of the space and the narrative my family had tried so desperately to deny me. I reached the edge of the stage and navigated the shallow ADA ramp located on the far side. The brass and percussion musicians stepped back instinctively, giving me a wide berth as I approached the center spotlight. I reached out and pulled the heavy corded microphone from its chrome stand. The metal felt cool and solid in my palm. I tapped the wire grill twice with my index finger. A sharp, high-pitched feedback whine pierced the ballroom audio system, instantly slicing through the chaotic chatter of the crowd. 300 faces turned toward the stage in unison, their expressions a blank canvas of rapt, breathless attention. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing through the massive acoustic speakers, smooth and entirely devoid of the panic that had just consumed the venue. "I know the sudden dramatic departure of the bridal party has caused a significant amount of confusion tonight. Allow me to provide some much-needed clarity." I paused, letting my gaze drift over the opulent room. I took in the suffocating canopy of imported white orchids, the massive swan ice sculptures slowly melting onto the floorboards, and the towering champagne fountain, still bubbling uselessly with vintage reserve. "First, I would like to warmly congratulate my sister and her new husband." I continued, infusing the words with a pleasant conversational tone that completely contrasted the grim reality of the federal arrests. "They have certainly orchestrated an unforgettable evening. The venue is breathtaking, the catering is exquisite, and Brittany's custom hand-stitched couture gown was truly a sight to behold. However, I feel it is only fair that you know exactly who sponsored this lavish, flawless celebration." I shifted my weight, leaning slightly closer to the microphone to ensure every syllable carried to the very back of the hall. "Every single crystal on that bridal dress, every slice of seared Wagyu beef on your plates, and every drop of premium liquor poured from these bars was financed by a $120,000 fraudulent loan. A loan that was maliciously taken out in my name using my stolen social security number and my pristine credit history while I was lying in a medically induced coma attached to a ventilator fighting for my life." A collective synchronized gasp erupted from the crowd. The sound was visceral, a sharp intake of air born of pure revulsion. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands, dropping her crystal champagne flute. It shattered sharply against the marble, but no one moved to clean it up. "The visionary tech investor you were mingling with tonight does not exist," I announced, my voice ringing with cold, hard authority. "Jamal is a broke, desperate con artist. He is a predator who manipulated federal banking nodes to siphon money from a vulnerable, critically injured victim. He built his entire synthetic empire on stolen credit and fabricated portfolios." I shifted my gaze toward the section of tables reserved for the groom's side of the aisle. Jamal's extended family sat frozen in their gilded chairs, their faces drained of color. His parents stared at the stage with expressions of sheer, unadulterated horror, the crushing weight of public shame settling heavily over their shoulders. The naive college acquaintances he had boasted to all evening shrank down in their seats, deeply embarrassed by their association with an exposed federal felon. And my parents, I continued, ensuring my vocal projection remained perfectly steady, were not simply innocent bystanders fooled by a charismatic son-in-law. Thomas and Brenda actively participated in the extortion. They willingly mortgaged my future to purchase their social elevation, leveraging my life-altering trauma to fund their country club aesthetic. "Turn that off!" A shrill, desperate shriek echoed from the rear vestibule of the ballroom. "Make her stop! Turn off the microphone!" Through the arched entryway, I could see Brittany. Two local police officers were holding her in a temporary staging area just inside the venue doors, waiting for the federal transport van to pull around to the loading dock. Her $16,000 gown was stained with dirt and heavily creased from her struggle in the administrative office. Her immaculate hair had unraveled into a chaotic, tangled mess. She thrashed against the heavy plastic flex cuffs binding her wrists behind her back, screaming at the sound technician across the room, begging anyone to cut the audio feed and stop the public dissection of her perfect day. No one moved. The venue staff, the wealthy guests, the musicians, everyone remained absolutely paralyzed, mesmerized by the brutal, undeniable truth echoing through the speakers. Her shrieks were nothing more than the pathetic, dying echoes of a shattered illusion. I looked directly at her struggling figure at the back of the room. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply smiled, lowered the microphone from my face, and gently placed it back onto the chrome stand. The heavy thud resonated through the ballroom, a final definitive punctuation mark on their absolute ruin. I turned my back on the silent, horrified crowd and slowly walked off the stage. As the rubber tips of my titanium crutches hit the polished dance floor, a guttural, animalistic roar shattered the stunned quiet of the ballroom. Thomas, fueled by the toxic adrenaline of a cornered predator realizing his entire kingdom was turning to ash, had somehow twisted his broad shoulders with enough violent force to break the grip of the distracted local deputy holding him near the vestibule. In the chaotic, high-velocity aftermath of the back-office breach, his temporary plastic flex cuffs had not been fully cinched. With a sickening pop of dislocated cartilage, he forced his wrists past his hips, snapping the thick plastic restraint in a blind, desperate frenzy. He was a runaway freight train of pure aristocratic rage barreling directly through the parting sea of horrified guests toward the stage. His face was contorted into an ugly purple mask of fury, spit flying from his lips as he shoved a terrified waiter violently aside. He intended to physically silence me, to literally beat the truth back into the shadows and forcibly reclaim his shattered social standing right in front of his wealthy peers. I did not flinch. I simply braced my weight firmly against my ergonomic handles, watching his pathetic charging silhouette close the distance. Before his expensive leather shoes could cross the final 20 yards, the world outside the Chateau Bellevue exploded into a blinding synchronized light show. The grand double-height glass doors of the main entrance suddenly illuminated the entire ballroom in a chaotic spinning wash of crimson and sapphire. The initial tactical unit that had raided the administrative suite had merely been the surgical strike. Now came the absolute hammer. The heavy glass entryways were thrust open with explosive, unapologetic force, shattering the cold night air and letting the driving winter rain swirl violently into the immaculate foyer. A massive, heavily coordinated phalanx of federal agents backed by dozens of local police officers in full tactical riot gear, marched purposefully into the reception hall. The sheer overwhelming scale of the law enforcement presence was awe-inspiring and terrifying. They poured through the vestibule like a dark, relentless tide of Navy windbreakers, and Kevlar fanning out across the perimeter with absolute, uncompromising military precision. The heavy thud of their combat boots against the mahogany floorboards created a synchronized, thundering drumbeat that completely swallowed the last lingering murmurs of the high society crowd. Every exit, every catering door, and every emergency fire escape was instantly blocked, guarded, and secured by heavily armed personnel. The room was plunged into absolute terrified silence, the kind of quiet that only accompanies the sudden realization of total entrapment. Thomas barely registered the secondary invasion unfolding around him. His bloodshot eyes were locked exclusively on me, his hands curling into violent fists as he blindly closed the remaining distance. He was less than 10 feet away, his breathing ragged and heavy over the ambient noise of the storm outside, when a towering federal marshal intercepted his destructive path. The agent did not merely stop my father, he obliterated his momentum entirely. The marshal stepped smoothly into Thomas's blind spot and delivered a devastating textbook tactical takedown. He drove his shoulder directly into my father's sternum, lifting the older man completely off the floor, before slamming him down onto the polished marble with a bone-rattling crash. The impact knocked the wind out of Thomas in a violent, wheezing rush of air. Two more heavily armored officers were instantly on top of him, driving their knees securely into his spine and wrenching his arms backward. They secured his wrists with heavy forged steel handcuffs that clicked shut with a harsh, unforgiving finality. Thomas writhed helplessly against the unyielding floor, his cheek pressed firmly into a spilled puddle of vintage champagne, his arrogant dominion permanently and physically extinguished. Special Agent Corcoran, flanked by two armed deputies holding standard-issue rifles, at the low ready stepped purposefully over my father's restrained, thrashing body. He did not spare Thomas a second glance or a single ounce of pity. Corcoran moved with the calm, measured authority of a man who owned the airspace, navigating the parted sea of terrified, glittering guests and ascending the short accessibility ramp to the main stage. He picked up the microphone I had just discarded on the chrome stand. The audio feedback hissed briefly, a sharp bite of static before he adjusted the height, his sharp, predatory gaze scanning the 300 affluent faces staring back at him in stunned, breathless silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain exactly where you are and keep your hands visible," Corcoran commanded. His deep, resonant voice projected an uncompromising federal authority through the massive acoustic speakers, leaving absolutely no room for debate, negotiation, or high society entitlement. "My name is Special Agent Corcoran with the United States Department of the Treasury. The statements you just heard from the young woman who addressed you are completely factually and legally accurate. The individuals who hosted this event have engaged in a massive coordinated syndicate of financial fraud, elder abuse, and aggravated identity theft. As of this exact moment, the Chateau Bellevue is no longer a wedding reception. It is an active, secured federal crime scene." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the ballroom, a collective shudder of realization, but no one dared to speak or move out of turn. The wealthy venture capitalists, the elite socialites, and the naive relatives were trapped in a horrifying, glittering cage of their own attendance. Corcoran continued his address, his tone clinical and detached, methodically dismantling any lingering doubts or sympathies the crowd might have harbored. He explicitly outlined the severity of the federal charges, confirming to the bewildered audience that the extravagant floral arrangements hanging above their heads, the top-tier catering resting in their stomachs, and the rental of the venue itself were procured through a complex web of stolen synthetic identities and laundered funds. He announced with absolute finality that every physical asset associated with the wedding was subject to immediate federal seizure and forensic cataloging. "No one is permitted to leave the premises until you have been fully processed, identified, and cleared by my investigative team," Corcoran ordered, pointing a stern finger toward the perimeter, where agents were already setting up temporary processing stations with folding tables and biometric scanners. If you are holding any gifts envelopes or monetary contributions intended for the bridal couple, you are legally required to surrender them to the evidence collection team at the main exit. Any attempt to conceal these items will be treated as active obstruction of a federal investigation. The atmosphere in the luxurious room plummeted into a suffocating, terrifying dread. The glittering fairy tale had morphed into a chilling, inescapable legal nightmare. Guests immediately began nervously placing brightly colored envelopes, thick stacks of cash, and small wrapped boxes onto the nearest dining tables, actively backing away from the illicit gifts, as if they were radioactive devices. The remaining waitstaff, fully realizing the severe gravity of the situation, quietly set their silver serving trays down on the bars and moved quickly toward the designated civilian holding areas, their pristine white gloves stark against the dark tactical uniforms of the surrounding police line. Yellow crime scene tape was systematically unspooled across the dance floor, cutting directly through the heart of the celebration. The crushing weight of the stolen debt, the suffocating anxiety of the past few months, finally evaporated completely from my shoulders as I watched the meticulous, clinical dismantling of their fraudulent empire. The crushing weight of the stolen debt, the suffocating anxiety of the past few months, finally evaporated completely from my shoulders as I watched the meticulous clinical dismantling of their fraudulent empire. The federal agents moved with a practiced, terrifying efficiency, shifting their focus to the immediate processing of the primary suspects right in the middle of the desecrated dance floor. Two heavily armored deputies hoisted Jamal from the carpet, dragging him by his armpits until he was forced to stand under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the main chandelier. The magnetic, untouchable tech prodigy who had commanded the room just an hour prior was completely eradicated. His bespoke tuxedo shirt was torn at the collar, his expensive bow tie hanging by a single thread, and his posture was crumpled. A senior federal officer stepped squarely into his personal space, holding a laminated card, and began to loudly and clearly recite his Miranda rights. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a stark metallic death knell to his fabricated reality. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the undeniable reality of his decades-long prison sentence crashed down upon him, Jamal's arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He did not just cry, he broke down in a visceral, pathetic display of absolute cowardice. Heavy, ugly sobs tore through his chest, his knees buckling so severely that the deputies had to physically hold him upright to prevent him from collapsing back onto the floor. Less than 30 feet away, the wealthy, respectable family he had spent the evening boasting about stood paralyzed in a tight, horrified cluster. His proud parents, who had flown in believing their son was a bona fide Silicon Valley titan, watched his criminal unraveling in sheer, unadulterated agony. His mother pressed a trembling, manicured hand over her mouth, tears of pure mortification spilling down her cheeks. His father, a man who had toasted his son's success just hours earlier, turned his face away. His jaw clenched tight, completely unable to bear the sight of his flesh and blood, sobbing like a cornered thief. The federal sweep then pivoted with ruthless precision toward my parents. Brenda had somehow managed to writhe into a sitting position against the base of the confiscated champagne bar. Her heavily beaded, exorbitant designer gown was now smeared with spilled liquor and floor dirt, the very picture of fallen aristocracy. As a tactical officer secured the cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, her survival instinct flared in a desperate, frantic barrage of transparent lies. She tilted her head back, her voice a shrill, grating whine that cut through the ambient noise of the room. She pleaded with the arresting officers, clawing at the empty air, frantically claiming that this was all a massive, catastrophic family misunderstanding. She shrieked that I was simply a confused, spiteful daughter who was blowing a minor financial disagreement wildly out of proportion, insisting that they had fully intended to repay the loans once their investments cleared. Agent Corcoran stepped directly into her line of sight, instantly cutting off her pathetic, desperate bargaining. He did not raise his voice or engage in a debate. He reached into his dark federal windbreaker and produced a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder. It was the complete, undeniable track and trace dossier I had meticulously compiled from my hospital bed and handed over to the authorities. Corcoran opened it right in front of her face, exposing pages of damning, irrefutable evidence. He pointed to the highlighted IP addresses originating from their own home, router, the forged digital signatures mimicking my handwriting, and the explicit logs of unauthorized offshore transfers executed while I was attached to a ventilator. He shoved the undeniable proof of her federal felonies right into her tear-streaked face. Brenda's jaw snapped shut instantly. The remaining fight drained from her body in a rapid, visible wave, leaving only the hollow, terrified realization that her high society masquerade was permanently extinguished. Thomas was hauled to his feet next his face, a bruised, defeated canvas of total submission. Together, my parents were marched down the long central aisle of the grand ballroom. The walk of shame was absolute and unforgiving. Hundreds of their so-called friends, the elite country club members and business associates they had sought to impress, watched in dead judging silence. Former allies actively turned their backs or whispered in fierce condemnation as the fraudsters were paraded through the vestibule and shoved roughly into the back of a waiting armored transport vehicle. The sudden violent extraction of the primary conspirators left a gaping surreal void in the center of the Chateau Bellevue. Brittany was the only member of the wedding party left standing in the crosshairs of the ruined celebration. Because her signature was miraculously absent from the core banking fraud documents, the federal agents had uncuffed her, deeming her a mere beneficiary of the crime rather than a primary architect. But her physical freedom was arguably a far worse punishment. She stood entirely alone on the desecrated dance floor. The venue's senior management, having been officially informed by the Treasury Department that not a single cent of the event's astronomical cost would be legally honored, ordered an immediate ruthless repossession of their property. Staff members moved in like a swarm of locusts. They did not speak to her, and they offered no apologies. Waiters aggressively yanked the heavy silk tablecloths from the dining rounds, sending expensive crystal goblets and fine bone china crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. Florists roughly dismantled the towering imported orchid centerpieces she had obsessed over for months, tearing the delicate white petals and tossing the expensive stems unceremoniously into heavy black trash bags. The romantic dim lighting was abruptly cut, replaced by harsh glaring maintenance fluorescents that stripped the room of any remaining magic. The extravagant, meticulously planned aesthetic evaporated by the second, leaving behind a stark, ugly reality. Brittany remained rooted to the spot, her breathing shallow, rapid, and erratic. Her $16,000 custom designer dress, the ultimate symbol of her stolen triumph, now hung on her trembling frame like a heavy, suffocating shroud. It was no longer a garment of royalty. It was a glaring public monument to her complicity, her greed, and her utter failure. The final devastating blow did not come from the police or the repossession teams. It came from her new in-laws. Jamal's extended family, the very people she had spent months trying to court, impress, and assimilate into, gathered their coats in absolute furious silence. They did not approach her. They did not offer a single word of comfort, understanding, or solidarity. Instead, they cast one collective withering look of pure disgust in her direction. They turned their backs on the weeping, ruined bride and walked purposefully out of the shattered ballroom, leaving her entirely isolated in the cold wreckage of her stolen fantasy. I left her standing there, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own making, and walked out into the biting winter rain. The chilled air hit my lungs like a baptism, washing away the last lingering traces of their suffocating influence. That night marked the definitive death of my old life and the violent, necessary birth of my new one. 6 months passed, a whirlwind of legal depositions, relentless physical therapy, and the quiet, steady rebuilding of an empire built on stone rather than sand. The justice system, often a slow and grinding machine, moved with surprising, terrifying efficiency when presented with a perfectly constructed forensic map of federal fraud. The sentencing hearings were swift, decisive, and brutally public. Jamal stood before a federal judge in a rumpled, oversized beige jumpsuit, completely stripped of the bespoke tailoring and arrogant smirk that had defined his elaborate con. The judge did not mince words, delivering a scathing, highly publicized indictment of his predatory tactics before slamming the heavy wooden gavel down on a 5-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was no parole available for wire fraud of that magnitude, no early release for good behavior when the crime involved siphoning funds from a critically injured comatose victim. He was hauled away in heavy iron chains, destined to spend the remainder of his youth as just another anonymous inmate number within the federal corrections system. Brenda and Thomas managed to narrowly escape a physical prison cell, though their alternative was arguably a slower, more agonizing form of execution for people so blindly obsessed with superficial status. The court handed down a decade of heavy restrictive probation. To satisfy the massive federal fines and the immediate court-ordered financial restitution, the government systematically dismantled their entire fabricated life. Their sprawling, manicured suburban estate was seized by the bank and auctioned off for a mere fraction of its market value. The luxury leased vehicles were impounded from their driveway in broad daylight. Their prestigious country club memberships were revoked. Their investment accounts were entirely frozen, and their social standing was utterly annihilated. They were forced to relocate to a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, left absolutely destitute and permanently shunned by the elite circles they had burned their souls to impress. Brittany's punishment was an existence of total hollow irrelevance. The fraudulent marriage was swiftly annulled by the state courts, erasing her highly publicized union, as if the lavish ceremony had never even occurred. The legal dissolution severed any remaining ties to the counterfeit venture capitalist she thought would secure her future. Without Jamal's fabricated wealth or my parents' stolen resources to constantly prop her up, she was left with absolutely nothing. No wealthy husband, no stolen trust fund, no glittering future as a high society wife. She became a local pariah, forced to accept a grueling minimum wage retail job just to survive, enduring the daily crushing reality of her own inescapable insignificance. While their world burned to the ground, mine was meticulously and triumphantly restored. Armed with the irrefutable evidence I had painstakingly compiled, I worked alongside the Treasury Department and the major credit bureaus to systematically purge every fraudulent strike against my name. The crippling $120,000 loan was entirely voided, wiped clean from my financial history as a confirmed syndicate theft. My credit score returned to its pristine state, a flawless testament to my actual fiscal discipline and hard work. I did not just survive the bureaucratic nightmare, I mastered it. The regional director of the Financial Crimes Unit personally invited me to their downtown headquarters for a private commendation ceremony. He handed me a framed letter of official recognition, openly praising the impeccable, airtight investigative work of my dossier, stating that my independent forensic accounting had handed his department the most seamless prosecution of his entire career. I channeled that overwhelming momentum directly into my own professional expansion. My accounting firm relocated to a sprawling sunlit suite on the top floor of a prime downtown high-rise building. But the crowning achievement was not the lucrative corporate accounts or the explosive record-breaking revenue growth. I carved out an entire wing of the new office space dedicated exclusively to a newly launched pro bono branch. I hired a specialized team of brilliant forensic auditors and passionate legal advocates whose sole mission was to assist victims of familial financial abuse. We became the ultimate lifeline for vulnerable people whose identities and futures had been hijacked by the very relatives they trusted. We provided them with the exact tools, fierce legal armor, and unyielding support I had been forced to forge for myself in the dark. Today the firm hummed with the quiet, highly productive energy of genuine success. I stood up from behind my heavy oak desk and walked deliberately toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the vibrant, sun-drenched city skyline. There was no mechanical click, no sharp squeak of rubber against marble. The titanium crutches that had carried me through my darkest battles were gone, relegated permanently to the back of a storage closet. My restrictive leg brace was a thing of the past. The grueling, agonizing hours of dedicated physical therapy had paid off in full, leaving me entirely, physically healed and standing tall on my own 2 feet, without any assistance. I rested my palms lightly against the cool, thick glass, watching the afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the bustling streets far below. My firm was thriving beyond measure, my credit was immaculate, and my health was fully and miraculously restored. But the absolute greatest victory was the profound, unshakable silence in my mind. The toxic weight of my family's expectations, the endless gaslighting, the relentless demands for blind compliance, they were entirely eradicated from my existence. I was perfectly at peace. I had stepped out of the suffocating shadow of their malignant greed and built an impenetrable fortress of absolute, untouchable independence. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp, air-conditioned office air, smiled at the limitless horizon stretching out before me, and turned back to my desk ready to conquer the day. Riley's brutal emancipation reveals a stark truth: shared DNA never guarantees loyalty. When kin weaponizes your lowest moments to finance their illusions, the ultimate defense is absolute severance. Her methodical dismantling of their fraud teaches us that vindication is not merely watching betrayers fall, it is the quiet, deliberate reconstruction of your own autonomy. Healing demands that we reject the obligation to endure abuse from those who demand our silent compliance. You must actively forge your own impenetrable sanctuary of self-worth. Please share a time when you had to sever a toxic relationship to protect your peace and comment below.